Realizing the danger of being caught in the open, Derek ordered a retreat back to the fence. As they turned to flee, the cavalry suddenly halted and wheeled around again. This time, they drew cavalry carbines from their holsters. "Ambush!" Derek cried, but the sergeant shouted, "Fire!" A series of sharp, explosive cracks echoed as the carbines fired. At such close range, the lead balls tore into the retreating, exposed Solonian infantry. The screams that followed were even more harrowing than before. Derek's guards were mowed down, blood spraying from their wounds. A stray bullet grazed Derek's arm, nearly causing him to drop his battle axe. Half of his charging party had fallen, and the survivors were terrified. "Retreat! Get back!" Derek scrambled back toward the fence, ignoring his injury. Their morale was completely shattered, replaced by pure, primal fear. The cavalry did not pursue, needing time to reload and having already achieved their goal of attrition. As the Solonians scrambled behind the fence, the sergeant ordered, "Dismount, bows." The riders dismounted with practiced ease. They reformed at a safe distance, arrows nocked, targeting the cowering Solonians. The Solonians were too broken to even attempt another charge. They huddled together, using their comrades and the fence as futile shields against the inevitable rain of death. The Grey Wolf Valley defense was crumbling, its morale at rock bottom. On the hillside, the main Conford infantry force continued its steady, ominous advance. I watched everything through my telescope from the ridge. I observed my light cavalry acting like wolves, alternating between archery and carbine fire to toy with the numerically superior Solonians. The Solonians were like trapped beasts, unable to strike back against their tormentors. "I see," I thought, questioning my previous tactical assumptions. The advantage of cavalry is truly immense. It was a textbook display of asymmetric warfare, mobility, range, and psychological terror. Against such poorly equipped and disorganized militia, my elaborate infantry maneuvers seemed almost unnecessary. I wondered if Leon's 100 cavalry could simply break them on their own. I realized I had overestimated these border tribes, having previously fought Harold's elite, professional armies. These were merely local militia, far inferior in every metric. I had been misled by my past experiences with stronger enemies. Beyond the collapsing defensive line, I spotted movement in the village. Solonian women and children were fleeing toward the deeper woods. It was a clear sign. The enemy, both soldiers and civilians, knew their end was near. I realized I could not hesitate. The Solonians must be annihilated. If the women and children escaped into the forest, they would become an endless source of future trouble. I lowered my binoculars and barked at my signalers. "Order Brendan to abandon the steady advance and charge. The Solonians are broken. Break formation and crush them. Order Leon to take the cavalry, flank both sides, and cut off their retreat," I added coldly. "Exterminate them all. Leave no one alive." The signalers acknowledged the order. A red triangular flag was raised, signaling an all-out, formationless charge. The bugler blew a series of sharp, urgent notes, signaling the assault. The piercing sound echoed across the field. The bugle call ignited the battlefield. Brendan, commanding from the hillside, saw the red flag and immediately understood my intent. Strike while the Solonians were shattered. He realized the opportunity for a decisive blow had arrived. "The Lord commands." Brendan drew his sword and roared, "Charge! Break them!" For Conford. Officers echoed the command. The disciplined infantry lines shattered, transforming into a surging wave of soldiers. Discipline gave way to the primal urge for slaughter, fueled by the drums and the sight of the collapsing enemy. Soldiers abandoned their formation, no longer caring about alignment. Howling like beasts, they charged toward the Solonian barricades less than 200 meters away. "Kill the Sorin barbarians. For the Lord!" The deafening roar of the Conford army crashed against the crumbling Solonian defenses. The ranks became chaotic and uneven as the soldiers sprinted forward. Musketeers gripped their weapons like spears, their original formation irrelevant. Brendan knew that speed and momentum were now the only things that mattered. Adrenaline surged. The soldiers saw only the terrified figures retreating before them. As the distance closed to 80 meters, They saw the despair on the Solonians' faces as their lines collapsed like a sandcastle under a hammer. This retreat only fueled the Conford soldiers' momentum. They're running. Kill them all. Officers led the charge, their shouts guiding the men and boosting morale. The Conford infantry hit the Grey Wolf Valley defenses like a landslide of steel and rage. On the flanks, Leon and 80 fresh cavalrymen burst from the woods like drawn blades. They bypassed the front, aiming to intercept the fleeing Solonians and civilians heading for the forest. The true slaughter began. The vanguard cavalry, having harassed the enemy with arrows and muskets, heard the thunderous charge behind them. They saw their own infantry, a blue and steel tide, rushing down the slope. "Don't block the path. Mount up and clear the flanks," the sergeant ordered. He acted without hesitation. The 20 cavalrymen pivoted and veered to the sides, clearing a path for the unstoppable infantry. The dust settled, revealing the terrifying sight to the Solonians. Derek, who had just stabilized his line after the cavalry harassment, felt his blood freeze as he looked up the slope. The disciplined army he had been fighting was gone. In its place was a chaotic, howling mob of black-clad soldiers rushing down like a tidal wave. There were no straight lines or rhythmic steps. Only distorted faces, murderous eyes, and flashing blades remained. Their roars were primal, raw, and filled with bloodlust. Their heavy, chaotic footsteps shook the earth. In a standard battle, such a disorganized charge would be suicide. If the defenders held their ground, the disorganized mob would usually collapse under the strain of their own chaos. But this required the defenders to hold the first wave. Derek felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the avalanche of death. His hand holding the battle axe trembled uncontrollably. His soldiers were pale with terror, their legs buckling. This raw, savage display was far more terrifying than the disciplined army they had faced before. It felt like a return to primitive, unpredictable tribal slaughter. "Hold the line," Derek roared, trying to drown out his own fear. Dragging his injured leg, he waved his battle axe, trying to rally his trembling men. "Close ranks. Spears forward. Don't scatter." With the help of his personal guards, he managed to gather a small group at the front. About 40 militia and veterans braced themselves, pointing their weapons at the approaching tide. They joined Derek in a desperate, beastly howl to bolster their courage. "Kill them." For Grey Wolf Valley. The Conford charge responded with a deafening roar. "Kill the barbarians. For the Lord." Two distinct, desperate roars collided in the valley. Without hesitation, the charge began with a thunderous roar. The Conford soldiers, fueled by the momentum of their downhill charge, slammed into the thin Solon line like a human battering ram. In that instant, all tactical drills and formations were discarded. Precise maneuvers, spear thrusts, shield coordination, and volley fire became meaningless in the chaotic, brutal melee. Only primal killing instinct remained. The strongest and most ferocious soldiers surged forward, ignoring formation to strike the nearest enemy. Roderick roared, using his 4-meter spear as a battering ram, slamming it with all his might into a Solon militiaman. The Solon soldier's wooden shield shattered, and he was hurled backward into the crowd, his fate sealed. Beside him, Elton, a swordsman, deflected a stone axe with his shield and slashed the enemy's unprotected neck, blood spraying across his face. Ignoring the gore, Elton howled and lunged at his next target as the battlefield transformed into a bloody meat grinder. The air was filled with the cacophony of clashing steel, splintering bone, and the screams of the dying, while the ground turned into a sickening, blood-soaked mire. Derek, his single eye burning red, fought like a wounded tiger, cutting down 2 Conford soldiers. Yet his personal guards and the defensive line melted away like snow under the sun against the violent onslaught. Overcome by terror, more Solon soldiers turned to flee, exposing their backs to the enemy. The Conford wave tore through the fragile resistance, sweeping toward the village and the fleeing remnants. Derek and his few loyalists were quickly swallowed by the Conford tide. Exhausted and hampered by his limp, the veteran Derek struggled after felling his second opponent. A Conford spearman, relying on the momentum of the charge, drove his steel spear into Derek's exposed side. The tip easily pierced the chainmail, sinking deep into his body. Derek stiffened, the ferocity in his eyes replaced by a hollow sense of relief. He looked down at the spear protruding from his chest, then up at the sky, his battle axe falling with a clang. His massive frame collapsed, kicking up dust and blood. Before his body could be recovered, it was trampled by the advancing Carnford soldiers, lost among the pile of sullen dead. The veteran of Grey Wolf Valley had fallen at the gates of the land he swore to protect. With their core resistance gone, the sullen defenders of Grey Wolf Valley collapsed entirely. The survivors, paralyzed by fear, abandoned all will to fight. They discarded their weapons and scrambled toward the village or over the fences, desperate to escape the slaughter. To the blood-crazed Carnford soldiers, these fleeing men were easier to dispatch than livestock. Unlike cornered animals, these deserters were driven only by pure terror, offering their backs to the pursuers. "Kill them! Don't let them escape!" the Carnford soldiers shouted, hunting down the fleeing men. Spears pierced backs, blades slashed sides, and musketeers used their rifle butts to crush those who stumbled. The battle devolved into a one-sided massacre. The screams in the valley grew sparse as the number of survivors dwindled. At the hilltop, Commander Elmont and his crew had finally positioned their 3 minion cannons. They prepared to calculate firing coordinates, breathless from the effort. Elmont raised his telescope to confirm the target, the heart of the Solon village. He froze at what he saw. The expected stalemate was nowhere to be found. Below, his infantry was already rampaging through the scattered Solonians. The Solon line had vanished, and any sporadic resistance was instantly crushed. Carnford soldiers were already clearing the village interior. "It's already over?" Elmont lowered his telescope, stunned and slightly disappointed. He had prepared to showcase his artillery, only to find the infantry had finished the job before he could fire a shot. He watched the slaughter below, a sense of absurdity washing over him. "The legendary, invincible Sorin barbarians, just like this?" he muttered. The reality was a far cry from the terrifying tales of Solon ferocity he had heard in the south. His confusion quickly gave way to a surge of pride. "It's not that the Solonians are weak," he told his crew. "It's that Lord Karl's Carnford army is simply too strong." This realization brought him a sense of smug satisfaction. The infantry's crushing victory proved the incredible power of the Carnford army. "Save your energy, boys," Elmont said, sitting on a rock to watch the spectacle. "The battle is over. Let's just watch our brothers finish the job." The crew relaxed, watching the carnage below with the casual detachment of victors. The battle had ended faster than anyone anticipated, leaving the Solon defenders no time to organize a retreat. From the initial clash to the total collapse, barely 10 minutes had passed. Of the 300 Solon defenders, nearly all were slaughtered, save for a few who fled early. Those who escaped toward the forest were intercepted and hunted down by Thorstein's cavalry. In the open, the infantry stood no chance against the horses. The cavalry's arrows and hooves claimed the rest. Behind the village, Leon's cavalry caught up to the Solon women and children attempting to flee into the mountains. Faced with armed, bloodthirsty cavalry, the elderly, women, and children could not resist. Those who tried were immediately cut down. The remaining women, clutching their crying children, saw the cold sabers and bows pointed at them and surrendered. They collapsed to their knees, weeping and begging for mercy in broken Plantagenet and Solon, their survival instinct overriding all else. Leon approached the shivering, tearful Solonian women and children. Seeing the mothers clutching their terrified offspring, he hesitated to swing his saber for the first time. Lord Karl had ordered total annihilation, but that was meant for organized resistance. Facing defenseless civilians, Leon's professional conscience and lingering humanity took over. "Cease attack," Leon ordered. "Bind them and hold them until the Lord decides their fate." The cavalrymen dismounted and began tying up the captives. Though their actions were rough, the blades remained sheathed. The battle noise faded, leaving only the groans of the wounded and the crackle of burning wood amidst the stench of blood and smoke. Surrounded by his guard, Karl crossed the ruined fence into the Grey Wolf Valley village. The ground was carpeted with Solonian corpses, their blood pooling into dark, viscous streams. Broken weapons and shields littered the ground, while the village huts burned. Brendan, his plate armor stained with enemy blood, hurried to meet him. He removed his helmet, his face flushed with the adrenaline of combat. "My lord," Brendan reported, "the Solonian garrison is effectively annihilated. Only a few fled into the woods. Pursuit teams are dispatched." He added, sounding surprised, "Initial count: 2 dead, 2 severely wounded, 5 lightly wounded. Total losses under 10. His eyes shone with excitement. "A resounding victory, my lord." Carl smiled, though his eyes remained calm and relieved as he watched his men looting and tending to their wounds. "Well fought, Brendan. I was worried when the recruits fumbled the formation, but the charge went smoothly." Carl's tone turned serious. "Victory is good, but cleanup is vital. Send the wounded back to Confort immediately. Ensure our fallen are registered and given proper burials. Second, compile a full report on casualties, captives, and seized supplies. Third, clear the battlefield. Collect all useful gear and bury or burn the corpses to prevent disease." "Understood, my lord." Brendan saluted and departed. The clean, low-casualty victory left the veteran commander energized. Carl surveyed the blood-soaked land, his soldiers, the huddled captives, and the distant, looming mountains. Grey Wolf Valley was taken. This was Confort's first step in clearing threats, bloody and direct, but necessary. With many more Solonian outposts remaining, this battle had sharpened Confort's blade and hardened Carl's resolve. "This is only the beginning," Carl whispered. Hoofbeats and clanking armor approached. Leon arrived with 30 cavalrymen, herding 40-odd-bound Solonian captives into the village square. The group consisted entirely of women and children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers. They huddled together, trembling and covered in filth and tears. Mothers stifled the sobs of their youngest children. They stared at Carl, realizing this young, stern man held the power of life, death, or slavery over them. Leon dismounted and saluted. Despite the grime of battle, his demeanor was calm. "Report, my lord. The cavalry has completed its objective. Thorstein is pursuing the stragglers, and we have secured the civilians as requested." He paused, glancing at the captives. "We killed those who resisted or fled, but these surrendered. I deemed it a waste of effort to continue the slaughter once they yielded, so I brought them for your judgment." Carl listened expressionlessly. He looked past Leon at the desperate, pleading captives. He recognized that look. He had seen it on the faces of his own people after Solonian raids. Now, the roles were reversed. "Very well," Carl said flatly. "If they pose no threat, killing them is a waste. Keep them. Mr. Grimm's caravan needs labor for mining and farming. These women and children can serve as slaves. They will be useful in time. Sell them to him to recoup our costs. Process this after the inventory is complete." Leon felt a wave of relief. He had feared Carl would insist on executing them to fulfill the total annihilation order. While he understood the cruelty of war, slaughtering surrendered civilians had crossed his moral line. The pragmatic choice of slavery spared him from carrying out a massacre. "Understood, my lord." A wise decision. Carl, already focused on the bigger picture, ignored the captives. The victory had boosted morale. It was time to strike while the iron was hot. "Leon, rest your men and horses. Ensure they are fed and equipment is checked. Take care of the horses. We need our mobility. Recall Thorstein. Stop the pursuit. It's not worth exhausting our horses for a few stragglers. Have him return to the main force." "Yes, my lord." Leon noted the orders. Carl walked toward the command hut with his officers. He needed the reports to plan the next strike. He had to expand his gains before other Solonian tribes could mobilize. Leon watched Carl leave, then turned back to the captives. The women seemed to realize their fate. They were to be sold into slavery. The women sensed their grim fate from the exchange. They were to be sold as slave. Survival, though stripped of freedom and dignity, was at least secured for the captives. The despair in their eyes dulled into a numb, hollow resignation. The children clung to their mothers, staring blankly at the armed soldiers surrounding them. Leon watched them, his heart heavy. He harbored deep hatred for the Solonians. His home had been sacked by Solon cavalry, his father died in grief, and he had survived only through years of conflict. He despised Solon soldiers and never hesitated to kill them in battle. Yet, facing these defenseless women and children, his bloodlust vanished. Whether due to a remnant of a knight's code or simple human pity, he could not bring himself to strike. They'll likely be worked to death or abused as slaves, Leon thought grimly. It was a miserable fate, but at least he wasn't the one executing them. The Lord decided their fate, and merchants like Grimm would take them. He was merely following orders. Perhaps letting them live as slaves to witness the suffering their own people inflicted is my version of mercy, he reasoned, seeking bitter comfort. Shaking off the sentiment, he reminded himself that mercy to the enemy was cruelty to his own. He ordered the officer in charge to guard the captives, provide water, and keep them alive until they returned. Yes, Captain. Leon turned to his horse, needing to organize the cavalry and recall Thorstein. The war continued, and he had to focus on the next battle. Personal empathy had to be buried beneath the tide of iron and blood. Soldiers acted like scavengers, methodically clearing Grey Wolf Valley. A new kind of industry replaced the noise of battle. Squads, clear the houses. Take everything valuable. The Lord says we split it by head, officers shouted. Soldiers kicked in doors and swarmed the huts. Their eyes gleamed as if they had found treasure. Despite Solonian poverty, the settlement's accumulated goods were significant. Everything from pottery and iron pots to furs, ropes, grain, and looted Plantagenet silver was seized. Soldiers eagerly claimed pots, furs, and salted meat. Because the loot was to be registered and distributed fairly, there was no chaotic infighting. Under officer supervision, the looting was efficient and orderly. Knowing they would share in the spoils, the men worked with high morale. Lack of internal conflict ensured maximum efficiency. Loot was piled in the center for the logistics clerks to register. Soon, mountains of goods rose in the village square. Roland arrived with the supply train and militia company shortly after the fighting. I immediately issued new orders. Roland, organize the laborers and militia company to harvest the rye. It's ripe, and we need every grain. I commanded. Yes, my lord. Roland obeyed. The laborers and militia, previously fearful, were now emboldened by the victory and the sight of the spoils. Harvesting was a task they knew well. Switch to sickles. Start with the ripe patches. Don't waste a grain. The men grabbed sickles and rushed into the fields. They moved in rows, the rhythmic sound of blades cutting through stalks filling the air as they stacked the rye. The efficiency was staggering. The harvest exceeded all expectations. Beyond the loot, they recovered cattle, goats, ponies, and sturdy wooden carts. Roland integrated these into the logistics chain, loading the grain and spoils onto the carts. They also liberated over 200 Plantagenet captives, who emerged from the woods like broken, withered wood. Their clothes were rags, their bodies covered in whip marks and frostbite, some wrapped only in straw. Most were locals from Conford who had been snatched by Solonian patrols while foraging. They had endured grueling labor, starvation, and filth, treated worse than livestock. Many had died, their bodies left in the wilderness without burial. Upon seeing the Conford banners, the silence broke into thunderous weeping. Some recognized friends and family among the supply train, embracing them in tears. The reunion of lost kin echoed through the forest. I announced they were free to return to Conford. The group fell silent, then knelt in the mud, weeping and thanking their rescuers. I watched the growing piles of supplies and the busy harvest with satisfaction. The battle had cleared the threat, trained the new army, and achieved self-sufficiency. The campaign's costs were not only covered but surpassed. I imagined Edgar's pleased expression upon hearing the news. Rest here, I ordered. Use the houses, stable the horses, and feed them well. We move tomorrow. The soldiers cheered, relieved to sleep in houses rather than the field. They quickly settled in, cleaned the huts, and tended to the livestock and horses. Night fell over Grey Wolf Valley, replacing the day's carnage with a heavy, blood-scented silence. Conford soldiers occupied the village, lighting oil lamps and hearths left behind by the Solonians. Low murmurs, the clatter of gear, and the occasional snort of horses filled the air. The village remained, but its masters had changed. Soldiers now cooked the spoils of war in the houses they had seized. The day's desperation faded as the new conquerors spent their first night on the blood-soaked land. While Solon survivors may have hidden in the mountains, the Conford mark was now firmly stamped upon the valley. At dawn, the army would march toward the next Solon stronghold with their spoils. Darkness pressed heavily upon the valley. Exhausted soldiers slept soundly in their tents, their snoring echoing through the camp. Only Derek's cabin remained lit, the flickering oil lamps casting a warm, savory glow against the cold night. A rough table held a yellowed map of the valley and its surroundings. I and my corps officers sat around it, our faces grave and alert. I sat in a crude, bearskin-covered chair, the pelt providing warmth against the chill. Rubbing my brow, I addressed them. We march at dawn, but the sullen soldiers on Grey Wolf Mountain remain a threat. Silence filled the room as the officers glanced toward the window, toward the enemy-held peak. I tapped the table. We cannot delay our main force, but we must secure our rear to prevent the Solonians from cutting off our retreat. I turned to Roland, who stood ready in full armor. The main force must stay intact, I stated. Roland, I want 2 elite militia platoons and 100 laborers to hold the valley. Is that sufficient? Roland frowned, considering the request. Pointing to the map, he replied, It is enough. The valley is narrow and defensible. With fortifications, we can delay any enemy force descending from the mountain. I nodded approvingly. Then here are your 2 objectives. I pointed to the village entrance. First, dismantle empty houses to reinforce our defenses. Strengthen the fences facing the mountain and repair the arrow towers. Second, and most importantly, maintain constant watch. If the Solonians move to cut our rear, you must act. Defend the position to delay them, and send a rider to report to the main army immediately. Do not let them flank us. The officers nodded, their expressions hardening. I turned to Roland. Who do you recommend to lead this? It requires a steady, reliable hand. Roland pondered several names before shaking his head. Finally, he brightened. I recommend Oliver. I paused, recalling the man. Oliver was a valiant warrior who had suffered a permanent knee injury from a crossbow bolt while protecting his comrades during the defense of Cranford. Despite being eligible for a pension, he chose to stay as a militia instructor. A good choice, I agreed. He is strict, disciplined, and performed well guarding the logistics train yesterday. He is steady and excels at defensive tactics. He is the right man. I sent for him, and soon, footsteps approached the door. Oliver entered, limping slightly, his old uniform worn but his posture rigid. Though startled to be woken, he stood at attention before the officers. I spoke directly. Oliver, we need someone to hold Grey Wolf Valley and secure our rear when we march tomorrow. I outlined the force of 2 platoons and 100 laborers, asking if he could handle the risk. Oliver froze, stunned by the weight of the responsibility. Then, his eyes ignited with intense fervor. Suppressing his joy, he stepped forward, trying to hide his limp. He snapped a sharp salute, his voice trembling with emotion. My lord, I accept. As long as I draw breath, no Solonian shall pass this valley. I swear it. His chest heaved with excitement. This was more than a mission. It was a recognition of his worth. Since his injury, he had feared his days of serving on the front lines were over. Now, he had been granted the honor he had long dreamed of. Good. I patted his shoulder. The safety of the valley and our brothers is in your hands. I trust you. Take whatever supplies you need. Your priority is to monitor and delay the enemy. Avoid a direct confrontation unless necessary. Holding the valley is a great service. Yes, my lord, Oliver shouted, his voice ringing through the cabin. I will not fail. As the night deepened, the meeting concluded. The army needed rest before the morning march. With the command and forces settled, I dismissed the officers. The group dispersed to handle their duties. Oliver followed, limping but standing tall. Inside, my blood had been boiling with honor, masking the pain in my leg. Stepping out, the biting night wind hit me, carrying the chill of the valley. The cold snap cooled my fervor, bringing my reason back. I realized the weight of my task, guarding Grey Wolf Valley against Solon soldiers with only 200 laborers and 2 militia platoons, protecting the army's rear. As I stared at the stars, Roland approached. Roland had just finished coordinating the logistics departure when he spotted Oliver. Roland patted my shoulder, his touch firm and expectant. Oliver, Roland whispered, this mission is vital. Don't fail the Lord or me. Oliver turned, moved by the man who had championed him. I knew I only held this position because Roland had recommended me to myself despite my disability. Oliver saluted firmly. Lord Roland, I will hold Grey Wolf Valley with my life. No Solonian shall pass. Roland smiled. Good. Tell me what you need before we depart, and I will provide it. I seized the chance. We can craft spears from local wood, but we need bows. My militia has hunters who can provide range support. Roland agreed. I'll give you 10 bows and 300 arrows. I thanked him and pressed for more. Can we have armor? Chainmail or even leather would help us survive against the Solon soldiers. Roland hesitated. Armor was scarce and reserved for elites. Giving it to militia would cause friction. Yet, he knew the rear guard needed protection to ensure the army's safety. Roland conceded. 5 sets of chainmail from the wounded and 10 leather armors. I was ecstatic, my limp forgotten. I pushed my luck. Could I have 50 more laborers? The current 100 are stretched thin between fortifications and logistics. Roland refused firmly. No. I pleaded. 10 then? Just 10 more. Roland remained unmoved. Impossible. I tried one last time. 5? Just 5. Roland cut him off, his tone stern. I can give you gear, but not men. We have many wounded to transport, and every wagon is needed. The captured supplies, grain, iron, cloth, require every available hand. 100 laborers is the limit. The militia is also stretched. The 3rd platoon must guard the supply train. The main force is fully committed to the march. I fell silent, understanding the army's plight. I felt dejected, wondering how to hold the valley with such limited resources. Suddenly, an idea struck me. Lord, what about the captured supplies? Are there clay pots, lamp oil, or animal fat? Roland recalled. Yes, there are some scraps in the pile. Why do you need them? They will be invaluable, I promised. Trusting my judgment, Roland didn't press further. Fine. Take whatever you need from the pile, pots, oil, or fat. I saluted, relieved and energized. With the gear and these supplies, holding the valley seemed possible. At dawn, Grey Wolf Valley was shrouded in mist. A bugle call shattered the silence, waking the conquerors. Confort soldiers emerged from their shelters, readying their gear. They formed neat ranks in the village square. Despite the chill, the men were excited by yesterday's victory. I surveyed my troops from a rise. After a night's rest and the spoils of war, morale was at an all-time high. Their nervousness had been replaced by confidence. Soldiers, I shouted, yesterday's victory was yours. Grey Wolf Valley is ours. Now, we march to expand our success. The men stood tall as the final logistics and troop assignments began. Wagons were loaded with the wounded and the fallen, covered in white cloth. The medical officer inspected the wounded to ensure they could endure the journey. The fallen were registered, and their gear and personal effects were packed to be returned to Confort for burial and compensation. Amidst a solemn atmosphere, soldiers paid their respects as the convoy prepared to depart, joined by 200 Plantagenet slaves rescued from the Solonians. In the morning light, the slaves appeared gaunt and frail from long-term malnutrition and overwork, many barely able to stand, let alone march. Despite a night's rest and warm porridge, they remained in poor condition. Follow the medical convoy to Confort, I told them. You will be cared for and given work there. Confort is your new home. Survive. Overcome with emotion, many slaves knelt and kowtowed to me in gratitude. They were assigned to the captured carts, helping one another as they joined the returning party. The first shipment of spoils, perishables, grain, salted meat, furs, and bulky household items was also sent back. Laborers and the stronger rescued slaves pushed the carts or carried the loads. Finally, the unarmed Solonian women and children were processed. Roland appointed a dozen-strong laborers as temporary guards rather than using regular troops. He armed them with sharpened wooden spears, iron machetes, and the very whips the Solonians had used on Plantagenet slaves, complete with the Solonian wolf-head emblem. The laborers, once downtrodden, suddenly found themselves masters over their former oppressors. Feeling the cold copper tips of the whips, they straightened their backs, eyes gleaming with long-suppressed satisfaction. Don't worry, the lead laborer promised Roland. If these Solonian bastards cause trouble, I'll make them taste their own medicine. He cracked the whip, the sharp sound making the Solonian women flinch. The women shielded their children, kneeling in the mud and kowtowing, tears streaming down their faces. They dared not cry out, listening to the whistling whip, the very sound of the fear they had once inflicted on others. The returning convoy carried the wounded, the fallen, the rescued, and the spoils, along with the report of victory. I wrote a letter for Edgar detailing the battle, the minimal casualties, and future plans, intended to reassure Lady Irene and Princess Louise. With the convoy gone, the Grey Wolf Valley camp felt emptier but more efficient. The remaining main force, 2 infantry battalions, most of the cavalry, artillery, and logistics, was well-rested and high in morale. The previous day's victory, the promise of spoils, and absolute faith in my leadership fueled their spirits. I mounted my horse, observing the troops fortifying the area under Oliver's command before glancing at the silent Grey Wolf Mountain. The mountain camp remained quiet, whether out of fear or caution. No matter, I thought, as long as Oliver holds the line. I turned my gaze eastward, toward the deeper forest and the next Solonian camp. Inhaling the crisp morning air, I signaled, "All troops, advance." With a thunderous response, the horns sounded. The blue-clad force surged forward, leaving the conquered Grey Wolf Valley to march toward the unknown. Sunlight glinted off their armor as they moved through the forest like conquerors. For the next 10 days, the Conford army swept through the edges of Solonian territory like a wind of death. Scouts like Phelan and Lucas acted as the army's eyes, infiltrating target areas days in advance. Like panthers in the shadows, they observed Solonian villages and outposts, recording weaknesses and routines. Under cover of night or fog, they eliminated sentries and patrols, clearing the path for the main force's strike. Once intelligence was received, I struck with an iron fist. Because local Solonian lords had sent their elite warriors to aid Derek at Grey Wolf Valley, they had been wiped out alongside him. Consequently, the remaining Solonian strongholds were left undefended. Many were now even more vulnerable than Grey Wolf Valley. Some villages contained only the elderly, women, children, and a few men with sharpened sticks. The Conford army tore through these defenses like a hot knife through butter. Before dawn, they would appear outside the sleeping villages, guided by the scouts' markers. As the alarm sounded, Conford soldiers surged through the broken fences. Resistance was futile and brief. The village was quickly subdued for looting. Laborers immediately harvested the rye, a vital strategic resource, while soldiers seized grain, meat, furs, and tools. Everything of value was loaded onto carts. Infrastructure like water mills and smithies was destroyed, and wells were fouled to prevent recovery. Rescued Plantagenet slaves were found in squalid conditions, their spirits lifting as they were fed and liberated. The army moved on quickly, leaving no time for the enemy to regroup. They left behind a scene of hell. Smoke rose from ruins, fields were trampled, and the bodies of Solonians lay uncollected. The tribal flags were torn down and trampled into the mud, a symbol of their total defeat. This was a calculated psychological blow, signaling the end of the old order. For half a month, the campaign operated with ruthless efficiency. A steady stream of grain, furs, tools, and livestock flowed back to Conford. The captured cattle and horses bolstered the territory's labor force and improved the army's rations. A significant number of Plantagenet slaves were liberated. Most, hailing from the borderlands, were deeply grateful to Lord Carl and Conford, readily joining the collective that granted them new lives. Accustomed to toil, they worked with immense zeal now that they had food, shelter, and hope, quickly filling the labor gap in the territory's rapid development. As for the captured Solonians, Lord Carl showed no mercy to these former enslavers. The healthy or skilled were sold to Grimm for cash, iron, and supplies. The rest were branded as slave laborers, forced into the most dangerous work, building new tunbeo, repairing roads, and mining, to pay for their kin's sins while fueling Conford's expansion. Wherever Conford's death wind blew, Solonian border outposts were either abandoned in terror or obliterated by thunderous strikes. Karl achieved his initial strategic goal, carving a safe buffer zone in the north with blood and iron while rapidly strengthening his own forces. Yet, the ripples of this storm were spreading within Solon, destined to awaken sleeping giants. Karl's death wind swept through several Solonian outposts with astonishing speed and minimal cost. With spoils piling up and liberated kin arriving, the soldiers' morale soared, viewing the Solonians as mere paper tigers. However, the momentum stalled upon reaching the final target, Nalan territory. Nalan territory possessed superior geography and defenses compared to the previous tribal villages. It sat near a river, ensuring a steady water supply. Crucially, its core lay on a plateau rising above the surrounding plains. Atop the plateau stood a sturdy, intact stone castle, a relic built by a former Plantagenet lord to guard the frontier, later seized by the Solonians. Below the castle, dense wooden houses formed an outer settlement. Survivors from previous battles had fled to Nalan, spreading terrifying rumors of the Conford army's scorched earth, tactics, and unstoppable might. Panic ignited. Most Solonian civilians and fearful fighters fled into the castle or deep into the nearby mountains. Consequently, Karl's forces occupied the deserted villages without resistance. Soldiers began looting, while laborers, ignoring the castle above, brazenly harvested the surrounding crops. Karl, accompanied by Brendan and Roland, observed the plateau from a hidden, wooded height. Through his telescope, he studied the castle, thick stone walls, intact structure, and vigilant guards on the battlements. Occasional arrows rained down on the laborers below, but they fell short, drawing only mocking laughter from the workers. Karl and his officers, however, remained grave. "It seems we've met a tough nut," Karl remarked calmly. Roland frowned, noting the castle's sturdy construction and strategic position, suggesting that a frontal assault would require costly, ant-swarming tactics with ladders. Brendan added that the garrison was large and determined. A direct assault could cost hundreds of lives, turning a glorious campaign into a Pyrrhic victory that might shatter morale. Brendan advised withdrawing while ahead, having already secured the surrounding villages and resources. Roland agreed, but Karl remained silent, his gaze lingering on the castle's layout and the winding, narrow streets of the village below. After a long silence, Karl turned to his officers with a resolute expression. "We attack." As Brendan started to protest, Karl cut him off. "I have a plan. Order the soldiers to prepare for urban warfare." Confused, the officers questioned how urban warfare in the empty village applied to a castle siege. Karl commanded them to drill in small unit coordination and room-to-room clearing, and to have laborers collect all available sturdy wood and furniture. He ordered them to continue provoking the castle guards to waste their arrows, then dismissed them. Though puzzled, the officers trusted Karl's judgment. At least he hadn't ordered a suicidal frontal assault. They departed to execute his orders. I paused. Though unspoken, my implication was clear. We cannot afford such a cost. Our campaign has been a resounding success thus far, marked by minimal casualties and glorious victories. If we turn a perfect victory into a Pyrrhic one for this final, tough target, or worse, suffer a defeat that shatters morale, our previous brilliant achievements will be severely undermined. Brendan believed the wise choice was to withdraw while ahead. The surrounding villages have been cleared and the grain harvested, successfully achieving my goals of strategic deterrence and resource acquisition. While the castle remains a threat, leaving it be, provided the Solonians stay inside, and returning home with my spoils and glory is the most prudent and profitable course of action. Roland nodded slightly, clearly siding with Brendan's cautious approach. I didn't respond immediately. I raised my telescope again, scanning the castle's main keep, towers, battlements, and gatehouse, before shifting my gaze to the empty village houses scattered along the hillside below. My gaze lingered on the slope connecting the castle to the village, and the village's narrow, winding streets. Time ticked by, marked only by the rustling wind and the distant shouts of the laborers. Brendan and Roland exchanged uneasy glances, their anxiety growing. They knew their young lord was decisive and aggressive, sometimes even reckless, and feared I would insist on attacking. Finally, I lowered my telescope. I turned to my officers, my expression calm and resolute, showing neither hesitation nor frustration at the obstacles ahead. "Attack," I said, my voice quiet yet resolute. Brendan and Roland froze, and Brendan began to protest. "But, my lord," I raised a hand, cutting him off. "I have a plan." I looked toward the village houses we already controlled, my gaze sharp. Order the men to prepare for urban warfare. Urban warfare? Brendan and Roland exclaimed in unison. The castle sat on a high plateau. Why focus on the empty village below? They wondered if I intended to clear out hidden remnants, despite the village appearing deserted. Yes, urban warfare, I confirmed, nodding. Focus training on small unit coordination, room-to-room clearing, and ambush tactics within narrow streets. Also, have the engineers and laborers gather all available wood, doors, furniture, and especially sturdy planks. I have a use for them. Ignoring their confusion, I ordered them to execute the plan and maintain strict surveillance on the castle, demanding an immediate report of any movement. Furthermore, make our grain harvesting even more provocative. I want to goad the castle garrison into wasting their arrows and energy on us. Though Brendan and Roland were baffled by the connection between urban warfare, salvaged wood, and assaulting the high-ground castle, their ingrained trust in their lord silenced any dissent. I claimed to have a plan, and they chose to trust me. At the very least, I hadn't ordered a suicidal ant-swarming assault with siege ladders, which brought them a measure of relief. Yes, my lord, the two replied in unison. Despite their confusion, they immediately turned to relay the orders, organizing the troops for urban warfare training and the collection of timber. I studied the silent Nalan castle, then left the observation point for the artillery position. I found Elmont overseeing the maintenance of the cannons. Elmont, I said, handing over my telescope, can your 3 babies breach that wall? Elmont took the telescope and focused on the thick stone walls of Nalan Castle. He scrutinized the masonry, weathering, and wall thickness. After a long pause, he lowered the glass with a mix of excitement and hesitation. My lord, Elmont said, the wall is solid, over a meter thick, likely filled with rammed earth and rubble behind the brick. My falconets could breach it with 20 shots, but he patted a minion cannon. These have large calibers, but lack the range and penetration of dedicated siege cannons unless. He looked at me with resolve. Unless we push them within 40 meters. At that range, using solid shot to target a single point, I'm 70% sure we can collapse a section. But the problem is your crew would be exposed to enemy archery, I finished. Exactly, Elmont nodded. My gunners wear no heavy armor and can't hold shields while loading. A few volleys would wipe them out. I nodded, unsurprised. I gripped Elmont's shoulder. I'll handle the approach. You just ensure the wall falls. Can you do it? Emboldened, Elmont stood tall. If you get us to 40 meters, I stake my life on breaching that wall. Good, I praised. Brendan and Roland soon gathered thick door panels, sturdy beams, and heavy tables from the village. I gathered my officers around a map of Nalan Castle. Gentlemen, I said, ant-swarming assaults are too costly. We must take this castle to secure our border and show the Solonians that stone walls won't save them. I pointed to the slope. We will use artillery to collapse the wall at close range. The officers looked skeptical. They knew the cannon's power, but breaching such thick stone seemed impossible. I ignored their doubt. Elmont needs to get within 50 meters, leaving us exposed to archers. I pointed to the wood. I need your strongest, bravest soldiers. Equip them in the heaviest armor available. They will work in teams to hold these thick panels and shields. I sketched a diagram. These soldiers will form a mobile shield wall around the cannons to block incoming arrows. Angle the boards to deflect fire. The cannons will advance behind this moving wall. Once in position, the shield wall must remain to protect the gunners until the breach is made. My eyes burned. Once the wall is open, our infantry will charge through the gap. The urban warfare training was for this, clearing the narrow, chaotic streets inside the castle. That is how we win with minimal losses. The officers' eyes lit up with realization and excitement. Brilliant, Brendan exclaimed. A mobile shield wall protects the gunners and avoids a bloody climb. And our urban tactics are perfect for the aftermath, Roland added. Leon nodded, his view of the minion cannons shifting entirely. He realized their immense value in this specific tactic. With this plan, we'll save so many lives, he remarked. The officers were now fully confident in my unconventional but pragmatic strategy. Prepare immediately, I ordered. Select the men, practice the formation, and ready the solid shot. We attack this afternoon. Yes, my lord. The soldiers' nervousness turned to confidence as they saw the Iron Tower troops practicing with the massive shields. A hearty lunch boosted morale. By mid-afternoon, the Carnford army assembled. Solon sentries on Nayland Castle spotted the movement immediately. Enemy attack. The Southerners are coming. To the walls, the sentry screamed. The alarm echoed, and the walls were quickly manned. Archers and soldiers scrambled to their positions. The Solon chieftain, a scarred man, climbed the main tower to watch. As they saw the formation, confusion and mocking laughter rippled through the defenders. There were no ladders, siege towers, or sandbags. They only saw 50 soldiers moving in a strange, slow formation. At the core were 3 short, black iron tubes. Surrounding them were 20 groups of heavily armored soldiers. They held massive, makeshift shields, doors and tables reinforced with heavy plating, forming walls twice their height. These shields angled to protect the gunners behind them. The formation crawled forward like iron-shelled tortoises. "What are they doing?" the Solonians jeered. "Trying to knock down our walls with doors?" The defenders' initial tension dissolved into utter contempt for this bizarre method of siege. Without ladders or rams, how could the enemy breach the walls? Did they think mere wooden boards could stop logs, stones, and oil? As the steel turtle formation adjusted at the edge of bowshot and advanced steadily, a cold sense of dread crept over the Solon defenders. These Southerners were cunning. Their strange tactics signaled a hidden, terrifying purpose. The scarred Solon commander watched the formation ignore the first volley of arrows, his unease deepening. Having served in larger tribes, he was no novice. This abnormal behavior was clearly not a mere demonstration. "Archers, keep firing. Don't stop," he roared, hoping to stall their advance. Solon archers unleashed a fresh wave of bone and stone arrows. The projectiles swarmed toward the giant wooden shields like angry hornets. A rhythmic, thunderous clatter echoed as the arrows struck the thick timber. The shields were soon bristling with arrows, looking like gray, shaggy beasts. Yet, aside from leaving dents and white marks, the ordinary arrows failed to penetrate. A few muffled grunts came from behind the shields, but the formation remained unbroken. The Carnford heavy infantry, having shaken off their initial tension, quickly adapted to the rhythm. With veins bulging and teeth gritted, they marched forward with steady, coordinated steps. 3 black cannons were pushed along directly behind them. Seeing them advance unscathed, the commander's heart sank. His eyes locked onto the short, dark iron tubes peeking through the shield gaps. A chilling realization struck him. Cannons. They're cannons. He had heard tales of these weapons from the Plantagenet kingdom, monstrous devices capable of spitting death with thunderous roars. Rumor held that their iron balls could shatter stone walls. The tubes before him matched the descriptions perfectly. The commander's blood ran cold as the enemy's plan became clear. They weren't planning an ant-swarming assault. They intended to blast a breach in the wall at point-blank range. Once the wall crumbled, the armored Carnford infantry would pour through like a flood. Without the high ground, the castle's defenses would collapse into a brutal, losing street fight. "Stop those cannons," the commander shrieked. "Get the heavy arrows from the armory. Switch to armor-piercing arrows now." His officers looked stunned and pained. Heavy arrows were rare, labor-intensive, and required powerful bows. The armor-piercing arrows, tipped with expensive, refined iron pyramids, were the castle's prized reserves, meant only for dire emergencies. "Do it!" The commander kicked an officer, his single eye flashing with menace. "If the wall falls, we die anyway. Move." No one dared hesitate further. Soldiers soon hauled 2 heavy barrels from the deep armory. Inside lay thick-shafted arrows with cold, dark, lethal tips. The archers eagerly discarded their ineffective hunting arrows for the heavy armor-piercing ones. They switched to stronger bows, took a breath, and re-aimed at the steel turtles. At 70 meters, the increased power was lethal. Loose. The bowstring snapped with a deeper, more powerful thrum as the armor-piercing arrows whistled toward the shields. The impact sound changed, a sharp, biting thud. Arrows now bit deep into the wood, some even punching through the edges of the boards. A few found the gaps between shields or caught soldiers in moments of fatigue. Ugh! Hit! came the pained cries from behind the shield wall. 3 or 4 Conford heavy infantrymen staggered as arrows struck their shoulders, arms, or thighs. Yet, the formation did not collapse. The wounded soldiers merely gritted their teeth, holding their shields higher and angling them to deflect further strikes. Though the arrows pierced leather and chainmail, the double-layered mail and plate components prevented fatal wounds. The pain was intense, but not enough to incapacitate them. "Hold steady. Keep moving," the officer shouted. "For Conford. Push." The infantry roared, pushing through the pain to drive the formation forward at an unrelenting pace. The cannons were now so close that the casting patterns on their barrels were visible. At 40 meters, the Solon commander turned deathly pale. Their most effective countermeasure had failed to stop the advance. "Logs, stones, oil, prepare them," he screamed in desperation. He knew that if those cannons fired at this range, the wall was lost. The Solon defenders scrambled to execute his desperate order. Strong soldiers hoisted heavy stones and logs, ready to crush the shields below. Others prepared barrels of naphtha to unleash a sea of fire. But as they leaned over the battlements, exposing themselves to drop their payloads, a thunderous roar erupted. Boom, 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 boom. A sudden, rhythmic volley of gunfire erupted, sounding like rapid-fire popping beans, a mechanical, lethal cadence. Dozens of scorching lead bullets tore through the air, striking the Solon soldiers emerging from the Nalan castle battlements. "Uft, uft," cries of pain and shouts of "my arm" echoed. The lead projectiles easily pierced the soldiers' thin leather armor, embedding deep into flesh and bone. The kinetic impact threw the victims backward, accompanied by the sickening sounds of shattering bone and bodies hitting the ground. Dropped stones and rolling logs tumbled back onto the ramparts, crushing several of their own men in the chaos. Barrels of naphtha were overturned, drenching the ramparts and the Solon commander in the pungent, sticky liquid. The nauseating smell was overwhelming, though the soldiers were spared from being burned alive as the oil was cold. Ignoring the stench, the commander risked his life to peer over the parapet. He saw them. About 70 meters behind the Iron Turtle formation stood 60 Conford musketeers. They were organized into 2 loose lines, executing a disciplined volley fire. As the first rank retreated to reload, the second stepped forward to aim and fire, their gun smoke still hanging in the air. This precise volley had instantly suppressed the defenders' counterattack. Their muskets were superior to the Solon hunters' weapons, boasting greater range, accuracy, and reload speed. "How is this possible?" the commander thought, just before another volley rang out. He instinctively ducked. A bullet whizzed past his scalp, leaving the faint scent of singed hair. Thud! Behind him, a guard preparing to hand over arrows collapsed, a bloody hole in his forehead. The guard died instantly, his arrows scattering across the floor. A chill gripped the commander's heart. He had narrowly escaped death. These muskets were terrifyingly accurate, capable of picking off targets from 70 meters away. The Solon archers, previously emboldened by their armor-piercing heavy arrows, were now cowering behind the battlements, terrified to show their faces. Despite the commander's threats and rage, no one dared to return fire. The threat of instant death from unseen projectiles had broken their resolve. Resistance crumbled under the weight of superior, untouchable ranged firepower. The commander's shouts were met only by the panicked breathing of his men and the occasional crack of musketry. The defense of the ramparts had been silenced. He watched helplessly as the Iron Turtle formation advanced to within 30 meters of the castle base. Behind the shields, he could see the gunners preparing their minion cannons. They worked with efficient, lethal focus, clearing debris and adjusting the cannons under the cover of their shields. Fear tightened its grip on the commander. He knew the final, fatal blow was coming. The roar of those iron tubes would decide the fate of the castle. With morale shattered and all countermeasures neutralized, he was paralyzed by indecision. Despair settled over Nalan Castle like the encroaching twilight. With the Solon archers suppressed by the Conford musketeers, the ramparts were effectively abandoned. The Iron Turtle formation reached its destination without facing any meaningful interference. "Halt! We are in position," Elmont signaled. The formation stopped 30 meters from the stone base. the optimal range for the minion cannons to deliver maximum destructive power. Secure the shield wall. Clear the firing lanes. Elmont ordered. The heavy infantry braced their massive shields, creating a solid barrier with a 10-meter gap for the cannons. The remaining shield bearers reinforced the flanks. Elmont and his 3 gun crews moved in like sharks. Load, Elmont commanded, his voice raspy, clad in chainmail per my orders. The gunners, also armored, worked with a mix of survival instinct and hunger for victory. Despite the encumbrance of their armor, the crews moved with methodical precision. A loader inserted the propellant charge, and another rammed it home with a wooden rod. Next, a heavy solid iron ball was rolled into the muzzle and rammed firmly against the charge. The final gunner pierced the cartridge and added a pinch of priming powder. The gun captain stood ready with a lit slow match, eyes locked on the target. The other gunners stepped back, covering their ears and opening their mouths to protect their eardrums from the blast. The loading process was completed with impressive speed under the circumstances. Number 1 ready. Number 2 ready. Number 3 ready, the captain shouted. Elmont took a deep breath, channeling his past experience with naval cannons. He waved his hand and roared, "Fire!" The captains thrust their lit matches into the touch holes. Boom, boom, boom. 3 deafening roars erupted from the cannons before Nayland Castle, shaking the ground beneath the distant Conford infantry and their commanders. Thick, acrid white smoke billowed from the cannons, engulfing the artillery position and the forward shield wall like 3 blooming flowers of death. Through the swirling smoke, only faint, fleeting flashes of orange muzzle fire were visible. 3 solid iron balls tore through the air with a shrill whistle, slamming into the castle wall less than 30 meters away, all striking the same vulnerable base section. Boom, crash, crack. The impact felt like an earthquake. The sturdy brick wall buckled and shattered under the hammer-like blows. Debris showered the area as dust filled the air. The 2-meter-thick stone wall was breached, leaving a basin-sized crater that exposed the rammed earth and rubble filling within. Spiderweb-like cracks spidered across the surrounding masonry. Short, muffled screams echoed from inside the wall as defenders were struck by flying debris or injured by the violent tremors. Elmont coughed in the smoke, his face alight with ecstatic, intoxicated fervor. The roar and the destruction transported him back to his years on the decks of warships, trading fire with pirates and navies. It was the intoxicating thrill of power, destruction, and life-or-death control. Shaking off the nostalgia, he wiped his soot-stained face and roared at the gunners. "Good shot. Keep it up. Clean, reload, and aim for that crater. Bring it down." Energized by the display of power, the gunners shook off their fear and sprang into action. The swabbers used wet wool brushes to clear the scorching barrels of residue, cooling them down simultaneously. The hot metal hissed as it met the water, releasing a cloud of steam and smoke. The reloading process began immediately. Despite the heat and the suffocating smell of sulfur, the crew worked with practiced, frantic efficiency. Driven by the thrill of destruction, they completed the second reload in a minute. Fire! 3 more thunderous blasts sent iron balls slamming precisely into the widening crater. Crash! Boom! The destruction was even more severe. Large sections of brick and earth collapsed, forming a massive, jagged breach that left the wall groaning under the strain. On the ramparts, the Solon commander was nearly thrown off his feet by the violent tremors. Dazed and deafened by the roar, he watched in horror as the world seemed to crumble around him. Though he had heard of cannons, experiencing their raw, unstoppable physical power was terrifying. Seeing the breach widen, he realized the wall would soon collapse. If the defenses fell, all was lost. "Archers, shoot! Kill those gunners!" he screamed, brandishing his scimitar and threatening to execute anyone who hesitated. But the shadow of the deadly accurate musketeers loomed large. The archers looked from their commander's blade to the deadly cannons and the musketeers waiting in the distance, paralyzed by fear. To shoot meant risking a headshot. To disobey meant immediate execution. A clever archer found a compromise. Staying safely behind the crenellations, he fired his bow at a high angle, blindly launching an arrow into the sky. The arrow drifted aimlessly, falling harmlessly far from the artillery position. Seeing this, The other desperate archers followed suit. Yes, just shoot like that. Stay hidden and fire into the air. We're technically shooting. The Solon archers performed a comical, cowardly display, crouching behind cover and blindly lobbing arrows into the sky. The arrows fell weakly, mostly landing in the empty space before the wall, with some even dropping back inside, drawing curses from their own side. Accuracy and power were no longer concerns. It was the best survival strategy they could find. The Solon commander watched this absurd scene, his rage boiling over. His expensive armor-piercing heavy arrows and his elite archers were reduced to this? It was an insult to warfare. You cowards! He trembled, nearly fainting with fury. He wanted to execute them, but seeing the shared fear in their eyes, he knew his authority had evaporated. The morale of his troops had completely collapsed under the cannon fire. He looked down to see the gunners preparing a third volley. Seeing the pure terror in his soldiers' eyes, he knew his last hope was gone. The wall was no longer defensible. Staying meant being blown to pieces or buried under tons of rubble. Holding the wall was now a pointless, dishonorable death. Retreat. All troops off the wall, he croaked, his voice filled with bitter resolve. Fall back into the city. Prepare for urban warfare. Use the buildings and streets to make them pay. For the terrified Solon soldiers, this order was a godsend. They scrambled off the wall in a chaotic rush, flooding into the relatively safe streets of the castle. They were relieved to escape the crumbling ramparts. Some even looked at their commander with gratitude for sparing them from certain death. Surrounded by familiar stone houses and wooden sheds, the soldiers' panic began to subside. A twisted sense of confidence returned. They might be inferior in firearms, but surely Solon warriors could outmatch the invaders in close-quarters urban combat. They knew every brick and alleyway. They could use the terrain to inflict heavy casualties on the invaders. Clinging to this desperate hope, the soldiers took up positions in corners, doorways, and rooftops, preparing for a final, bloody resistance with bows, spears, and improvised weapons. Elmont's artillery continued to hammer the wall, aiming for a total collapse. Reload. Faster, he roared through the smoke. The gunners, faces blackened by soot and coughing, worked with frantic speed. The barrels were scorching, shimmering with heat, but victory was within reach. Boom, boom, boom. Deafening volleys of solid iron shot struck the same section of the wall with lethal precision. Each impact shattered masonry and compromised the wall's structural integrity, causing the internal fill to spill out. Finally, a last shell shrieked into the crumbling structure. Rumble! A deep, earth-shaking roar erupted as the wall collapsed like falling dominoes, spreading outward from the impact zone. Debris cascaded like an avalanche, creating a 10-meter-wide breach in Nayland Castle's defenses. Through the dust, the castle's interior streets and panicked figures became visible. Well done! Brendan and Roland cheered, joined by the soldiers' muffled roars. Elmont, however, had no time for celebration. Checking the barrels, he found them dangerously overheated. Cease fire, he ordered. The barrels will burst. Pull the guns back to cool down and clear the path for the infantry. The gunners quickly dragged the 3 cannons and ammo carts away to clear the assault route. As the dust settled, Brendan and Roland finalized their deployment. Brendan addressed the 1st Battalion. 1st Battalion, move through the side streets to secure the rear gate. Build barricades to seal the gate, and leave 1 company to prevent any Solonian escape. The other 2 companies will sweep from the flanks toward the main gate, trapping the enemy. He warned them to watch for the complex layout and maintain the first combat formation. This formation, a variation of the Mandarin duck formation, emphasized coordination between melee and ranged weapons. He turned to Roland. Roland, lead the 3rd Battalion to seize the castle's center and main intersections. Prioritize control of key routes to split the enemy. Don't get bogged down in alleys until the perimeter is secure. Understood, Roland replied. Brendan instructed Otto's musketeer company to provide fire support, using volleys to disrupt enemy strongpoints before infantry charges. Use lead shot to minimize our melee casualties, Brendan ordered. Otto saluted. Yes, sir. Brendan addressed the troops. There are fewer than 500 enemies, mostly terrified civilians. Do not fear them. His tone turned lethal. Anyone not wearing a Carnford uniform, soldier, civilian, woman, or child, is an enemy. Kill them all without hesitation. Hesitation is a betrayal of your brothers. A moment of mercy could cost a comrade their life. Failure due to hesitation will be met with military law. Remember that. Yes, the soldiers roared, their eyes hardening with resolve. This was a slaughterhouse. Only survival mattered. A trumpet blast signaled the general assault from Lord I. Brendan drew his sword, pointing at the breach. Do you understand? Yes, the troops shouted. Good. 1st and 3rd Battalions, attack. Kill. For Carnford. The blue-clad force surged forward like a tidal wave toward the breach. Roderick, a young but battle-hardened sergeant, led the 1st Battalion's vanguard. Despite his youth, his eyes were sharp as tempered steel. A product of my new army, he was a trusted veteran. The assault platoon moved quickly through the smoke toward the breach. Visibility was poor amidst the rubble. As they approached, shadows flickered and bowstrings hummed. Whoosh! Weak, panicked arrows flew from the smoke. The shield-bearers raised their wooden shields, deflecting the arrows effortlessly. Solonian skirmishers in the smoke, a soldier shouted. Roderick ordered. Spread out. Form the 1st combat formation. Shields in front, spears behind, muskets covering. Advance up the slope. The soldiers quickly organized into 3 small Mandarin duck units. Each unit featured shield-bearers with arming swords, pikemen with 4-meter spears, and musketeers in the rear. They climbed the rubble in a staggered formation. The shield-bearers watched the smoke through observation slits. Pikemen and musketeers kept their weapons ready. As the lead shield-bearers reached the top, they were ambushed. Kill! Desperate Solonian soldiers lunged from the smoke with rusted blades and crude spears. A recruit was struck in the thigh, his chainmail pierced, causing him to stumble. Another took a heavy axe blow to the shoulder, his armor dented but holding. Hold them! Roderick roared. A veteran shield-bearer parried a spear and thrust his arming sword into a Solonian's unprotected abdomen. The enemy soldier shrieked and collapsed, clutching his wound. As the veteran shield-bearers blocked the first wave, the pikemen surged forward, thrusting their spears like venomous dragons from behind the shields. Squelch! Arg! 2 Solonians attempting a flank were struck and tumbled down the rubble slope. Roderick, shielded by his men, thrust his spear with all his might into the densest part of the smoke and shadows. He felt the resistance of the spearhead followed by the sensation of piercing flesh. Ugh! A pained howl erupted from the smoke as Roderick retracted his spear, trailing a mist of warm blood. A silhouette swayed in the haze and collapsed. Advance! Push them back! Roderick commanded, his voice raspy from the slaughter. The wounded shield-bearer pulled back, and the 2 remaining shield-bearers roared, stepping forward to slam their shields into the enemy and obstacles. The pikemen followed, their spears darting like snakes through the gaps to strike down any Solonians who approached. Hidden Solonians attempting to ambush from the rubble were neutralized by the Carnford army's coordinated Mandarin duck formation. Any who showed their heads were either blocked by shields or instantly finished by hidden spears. The demoralized Solon soldiers, scattered by the artillery, could not withstand the disciplined assault of the Carnford assault platoon. Leaving 7 or 8 corpses behind, the remaining Solonians broke and fled into the complex streets of the castle. Secure the breach. Advance 10 paces and establish a line. Roderick ordered, prioritizing consolidation over reckless pursuit. 2 squads pushed forward to clear the area, while another squad and the musketeers held the breach. Musketeers, fire at will on the fleeing enemy. Roderick ordered. Bang! 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 6 musketeers stepped forward within the safety of the breach and unleashed a lethal volley at the retreating Solonians. Gunpowder smoke filled the air as lead balls whistled. Help! 3 or 4 Solon soldiers were struck in the back and collapsed, unable to rise. With the resistance cleared, the smoke thinned, revealing the layout of the castle streets. Roderick wiped blood and ash from his face and looked back. Brendan led the main force of the 1st Battalion, like a bursting dam, pouring into the still warm breach of Nayland Castle. With dark blue uniforms, shining armor, and bristling spears, the conquerors flooded the fortress once considered impregnable. Roderick's platoon acted as the spearhead, diving into the narrow, winding, and dangerous streets of Nayland Castle. The houses were silent, with only distant sounds of combat echoing through the streets. Solonian civilians hiding in corners screamed in terror as the Conford soldiers appeared, fleeing deeper into the alleys. Roderick ignored the civilians, focusing entirely on hunting down organized enemy resistance as per Brendan's orders. Soon, chaotic shouting and footsteps erupted from a wider street corner ahead. About 20 Solon soldiers, led by a small commander, charged with bloodshot eyes, attempting to crush the Conford squad. "Halt! Form up," Roderick commanded. Experienced in battle, I knew that in narrow streets, formation and firepower outweighed individual valor. The soldiers stopped instantly. The shield-bearers crouched, slamming their shields into the ground to form a wall. The pikemen leveled their spears, creating a formidable forest of steel. The musketeers squeezed through the rear gaps, extending their loaded matchlock muskets over the shields and spears, locking onto the approaching Solonians. The distance closed, 40 meters, 30, 20. The grimaces of the Solonians were clearly visible. Roderick counted down the distance, and at 15 meters, the optimal range, I shouted, "Fire!" Bang! Bang, bang, bang. 6 matchlock muskets roared simultaneously, sending a hail of hot lead into the tightly packed, unprotected Solonian crowd. Squelch! My leg! Help! The leading Solonians were struck by invisible hammers, collapsing with blood spraying from their wounds. The kinetic energy of the lead balls and the horrific trauma threw the remaining Solonians into disarray. Blocked by their writhing comrades, the attackers faltered, their faces filled with terror and hesitation. Musketeers, fall back and reload. Roderick roared, "Attack! Kill them all!" The shield-bearers and pikemen surged forward like tigers, pouncing on the chaotic remnants. The Solonians, having lost their momentum and organization, were defenseless against the disciplined Conford counterattack. The narrow street filled with the sounds of blades, spears, and dying groans. The battle ended in 2 minutes. The 20 Solonians were wiped out, with only a few escaping into side alleys. "Don't stop. Advance. Secure the next intersection," Roderick ordered, wiping blood from his face. I knew we had to penetrate deep before the enemy could reorganize. The unit moved out, maintaining formation as they pushed deeper into the streets. As they approached the next intersection, the situation changed abruptly. Whoosh! Arrows whistled from windows, rooftops, and wall breaches, targeting the Conford soldiers. "Watch out for arrows." 2 pikemen on the flank were struck, one in the shoulder, one in the thigh, and they collapsed, bleeding. Their chainmail absorbed some impact, preventing fatal wounds, but they were incapacitated by the pain. "Shields! Raise shields!" Roderick shouted. The soldiers raised their shields, but the arrows came from high angles, making full protection difficult. Another volley struck, a shield-bearer blocked, but the arrows were different. A heavy arrow pierced his iron-reinforced wooden shield with a loud thud. The armor-piercing arrowhead drove deep into his leather and chainmail, the force knocking him backward and causing him to drop his shield. "It's armor-piercing heavy arrows. It's an ambush. Retreat. Fall back." I realized the enemy had prepared a trap with high ground advantage and heavy weaponry. Charging this street would only lead to heavy casualties. "Drag the wounded back," Roderick ordered, pulling his fallen shield-bearers and spearmen toward the cover of a ruined wall and street corner. The remaining soldiers retreated under the cover of their shields. Reaching safety, Roderick saw Brendan's 1st Battalion pouring through the breach they had created, forming up nearby. Roderick rushed to Brendan. "Sir, an ambush ahead. Solon archers in the buildings are using heavy arrows that pierce our shields. We can't push through." Brendan frowned, looking toward the silent street. He could still hear the lethal rain of arrows. The enemy was using the terrain to stall the Conford army. No frontal assault, Brendan decided. He turned to Otto, the musketeer company commander. "Otto, take your men. Suppress those archers. Have the bowmen assist. Force those rats out, or keep their heads down." "Yes, sir," Otto roared to his troops. "Musketeers move. 1st and 2nd ranks, take the street. 3rd and 4th, flank them. Move." Nearly 100 musketeers advanced through the infantry lines. They established firing positions behind ruins and doorways. 30 archers spread out to provide support. Carnford's ranged fire poured into the windows and rooftops. Bang! Bang! Whoosh! Musket fire and bowstrings combined as lead and arrows swarmed the buildings. Windows shattered and walls were pitted with lead, but the Solonians held the advantage. They fired from tiny apertures and attic vents, while protected by stone walls. Carnford's firepower struggled to achieve a decisive result against the entrenched enemy. Solonian return fire kept the Carnford soldiers pinned down. The assault reached a stalemate. Brendan watched as another musketeer fell, realizing that every delay allowed the Solonians to reorganize. He spotted a narrow alley leading toward the rear of the enemy position. "Roderick," Brendan ordered, "take 3 extra shield bearers and your platoon through that alley. Bypass them and strike from the rear to break their formation." Roderick saluted. "Yes, sir." Task accepted. Reinforced with 3 sturdy shield bearers, the platoon's morale surged. Roderick signaled his 20 men, "Follow me." They vanished into the dark alley. Brendan watched them go, feeling the mounting pressure as more musketeers fell to the Solonian archers. "Hurry, Roderick," he whispered. Inside the alley, the air was cold and stagnant. The soldiers ran in heavy chainmail, their breathing echoing against the high stone walls. The path twisted through the irregular architecture, causing them to lose their sense of direction. "Stop! Hold position," Roderick commanded, gasping for air. Knowing they couldn't wander aimlessly, he ordered a soldier to crouch. Using the man as a human ladder, Roderick climbed to the top of a low wall. From his vantage point, he saw the 3rd Battalion entering the castle and, more importantly, the rear of the street where the Solonian archers were hidden. "Got it," he noted the relative position. He jumped down and patted the soldier's shoulder. "Good work. Fall in. We're behind them now." Roderick whispered to his men. "Find the nearest exit and strike." They resumed their run, no longer aimless. As they crossed a wide intersection to reach the target, disaster struck. The alleyway twisted repeatedly, following the irregular layout of the castle's architecture rather than running straight. The surroundings soon became indistinguishable: high walls, narrow alleys, and sealed doors. Roderick quickly lost his sense of direction, becoming unsure of his location and unable to find the exit to their target. "Halt! Hold position," Roderick signaled, leaning against the cold stone wall, gasping for breath as sweat streamed down his face. Having once nearly died after getting lost in a labyrinthine city, I knew aimless wandering was a death sentence. "You, crouch," Roderick ordered a sturdy soldier. The man obeyed, bracing his back against the wall. Roderick handed his spear to a soldier, took a running start, and vaulted off the man's knees and shoulders. The soldier grunted but held firm, hoisting Roderick high enough to clear the low wall. Roderick gripped the low eaves of a nearby house and hauled himself up, ignoring the danger to scan his surroundings. From my vantage point, the view opened up. I spotted the massive breach in the distant wall and the Carnford army pouring through like a blue stream. Roland's 3rd Battalion moved swiftly, crossing the breach and pushing deep into the castle. I scanned the area, quickly spotting Brendan's front line. Through the smoke and muzzle flashes, I could make out their musketeers and archers exchanging fire from behind cover. "Understood." Roderick noted the relative distance and orientation between the front lines and his current position, his heart surging with relief. Roderick calculated that he had circled to the street's rear, likely nearing the castle's center. Daring not to linger, I dropped back to the ground and patted the soldier who had acted as my human ladder. "Good work. Return to your unit." "We've circled behind them," Roderick whispered to his men. "Find the nearest exit and flank them. Follow me." Without hesitation, Roderick led his men into an alleyway that promised the fastest route to the enemy's flank, relying on the layout he had memorized from the rooftop. Though exhausted, the soldiers were heartened by my clear sense of direction and followed me closely. Though the alleyways remained complex, Roderick now had a clear sense of direction and moved with purpose. Roderick led his squad through the labyrinthine streets, choosing paths that aligned with his mental map toward their objective. As they crossed an open intersection to enter an alley leading toward their objective, disaster struck. Urgent, panicked shouts in the Solon language erupted from the alley corner ahead. Heavy, Rapid hoofbeats echoed through the narrow passage, growing louder by the second. Damn it! Roderick's heart sank. It was Solon cavalry. For his exhausted, disorganized infantry squad, a cavalry charge in these tight confines meant certain death. Several Solonians on northern ponies burst into view, clad in leather armor and brandishing sabers and spears. They looked as surprised to find Carnford infantry as the soldiers were to see them. At 20 meters, the lead rider shrieked and charged. The others followed, their horses' hooves thundering violently. Form up. Move. Roderick roared with every ounce of strength. The sheer kinetic force of the charging horses paralyzed the soldiers with primal fear. The men froze, their minds and bodies locking up in the face of an overwhelming threat. Several shield-bearers stood catatonic, pale-faced, forgetting even to raise their shields as the horses bore down on them. Stop gawking. Enraged, Roderick kicked a frozen shield-bearer to the ground. Shield-bearers, to the back. Roderick screamed, grabbing a spear. Spearmen, front. Level your pikes at their chests and necks. Form a spear formation or be trampled. Driven by survival instinct and the terror of their commander, the soldiers snapped out of their stupor. The shield-bearers scrambled behind the spearmen, shields raised, eyes wide with terror. Raise your spears. Angle them. Roderick demonstrated, spear in hand. Veteran spearmen stepped forward, bracing their 4-meter pikes at 45-degree angles, steel tips gleaming in the dim light. The narrow alley allowed only 5 men to stand abreast. The rear ranks rested their spears on the shoulders of those in front, creating a dense wall of points. It was a crude Carnford army spear formation, but it formed a formidable wall of iron thorns. Horses are living creatures, not machines. They feel fear. Confronted by the wall of shimmering, sharp tips, the Solonians' mounts instinctively recoiled. 10 meters out, the lead ponies reared and slowed, veering away to avoid the lethal spikes, stalling the charge. These were light cavalry, not heavy knights. They lacked the armor and the resolve to charge a dense pike wall. They dared not strike. The riders circled nervously, looking for gaps or reaching for bows to engage from a distance. Musketeers, Roderick shouted. Aim and fire. The 6 musketeers, emboldened by the spear wall, stepped forward. They leveled their matchlock muskets over the shoulders of their comrades, targeting the riders. Bang! Bang! The deafening reports filled the narrow alley, followed by thick, white smoke. 2 Solonians screamed as they were struck. One took a shot to the chest and fell backward, dead. The other, hit in the shoulder, tumbled from his mount. Their riderless horses panicked, further disrupting the enemy formation. Seeing their comrades fall and the spear wall still standing, the remaining riders lost their nerve. Run! They cried, turning their horses and fleeing back the way they came, leaving behind 2 corpses and 2 terrified horses. The immediate danger passed, and the soldiers slumped, exhausted by the brief, intense struggle. Roderick, drenched in cold sweat, scanned the battlefield. One wounded Solonian lay on the ground, his foot caught in a stirrup, struggling in vain. He looked at Roderick with desperate, pleading eyes. Roderick felt nothing for the young, bloodied face. He remembered Brendan's cold orders and the comrades lost to the Solonians. Mercy was a lethal poison here. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and drove his spear into the man's throat. Squish! The rider stiffened, his pleading eyes dimming into death. Roderick wiped his spear on the corpse's armor. Reform. Check gear. Move out. The soldiers watched in silence. The brutal execution purged any remaining pity from their hearts. This was war. The squad moved on, their expressions hardened. Roderick navigated toward the sounds of battle and smoke he had seen from the rooftops. They encountered no further resistance, only the fearful eyes of locals watching from windows. After 2 more turns, Roderick spotted daylight, an exit leading to a wider street. Halt, he signaled, keeping the squad hidden. I pressed against the wall, peeking cautiously around the corner. My heart sank at the sight. The street was 8 meters wide. Solonians were active on both sides. To the right, where Brendan was attacking, dozens of Solon archers and infantry were firing toward the main battle. That was the main front, and their objective, the rear of the Solonian line, lay just beyond. However, to the left, 30 meters away, a dozen Solonian soldiers were stationed as a flank guard. They were alert, and as I peeked, one or two seemed to notice me. Trouble, I thought. If they charged right to attack the Solon line's rear, their own flanks would be exposed to a dozen Solon soldiers on the left. A single charge or volley from the enemy would crush their 20-man squad, leaving them surrounded and doomed. Splitting their forces would leave both groups too weak to succeed. They would likely fail to break the Solon line for Brendan, while simultaneously being wiped out by the soldiers on the left. I panicked. A direct assault or splitting up were both suicide, but retreating meant the sacrifice of the frontline troops would be in vain. I had to act fast. The Solonians on the left had spotted us and were shouting as they approached the alley. My mind raced. With time running out, I had to make a desperate choice. I whispered a gamble to Joel, the musketeer squad leader. Take your men to the left and fire a volley at those soldiers. Don't worry about accuracy. Just make enough noise to scare or stall them. I turned to my shield bearers and spearmen. The rest of you, follow me. We charge right to hit the archers and relieve our main force. Do not look back. The soldiers, though tense, regained their resolve. Joel, fire first, then we charge. Move. Joel and his 5 musketeers moved to the left alley edge to find an angle. I gripped my spear and shield, poised like a leopard. Asterisk bang. Bang bang bang. Asterisk as the Solonians approached within 20 meters, for shots erupted from the shadows. Smoke filled the air, most shots missed, but one stray bullet grazed a soldier's arm, drawing a cry of pain. The sudden volley and smoke terrified the Solonians, who stopped in their tracks, fearing a larger ambush. Now, kill! I roared, leading the charge out of the alley. The street opened up before me. Dozens of Solon archers and infantry were engaged with Brendan's main force. Nearby, a small group of about a dozen Solonians stood gathered. A leader in leather armor was conferring with a panicked Solon cavalryman. The cavalryman, having retreated from the alley earlier, spotted me and screamed a warning to the leader. The rider immediately whipped his horse and fled, leaving the leader stunned. The leader turned and saw my Confort soldiers charging out. Panic flashed across his face, but he rallied his men. Turn around. Engage them. The Solonians scrambled to face the incoming charge. Meanwhile, another group of 17 or 18 Solonians further back noticed the chaos and moved to flank me. I realized we were in danger of being pincered. Joel, hold them off, I shouted. Joel and his men, struggling to reload, saw the reinforcements approaching. A novice, Joel's hands shook violently with terror. His mind went blank. As the enemy closed to 70 meters, too far for an effective shot, Joel panicked and pulled the trigger. Bang! The other 5 musketeers instinctively followed suit. 6 shots rang out. At 70 meters, the shots were wildly inaccurate. Only one soldier was wounded. The rest missed entirely. Joel turned pale, realizing his mistake. Reloading took half a minute, leaving them vulnerable to a charge. If they were overrun, my rear would be exposed. The mission would fail, and we would all die. Despair washed over Joel, but fortune favored the Confort squad. The 17 Solonians were not elite, but poorly trained guards. They possessed an instinctive fear of muskets. The noise, smoke, and the sight of their wounded comrade shattered their nerves. Seeing the barbarians fire from such a distance, they assumed a massive ambush awaited them. Panic overcame their sense of duty. Run? The muskets are too strong. There are more of them. The Solonians abandoned their post and fled toward the rear, disappearing in a panic. Joel and his men stared in disbelief. Their blunder had somehow saved them. Reload. Support the commander. Joel shouted, his fear replaced by relief. They scrambled to reload, grateful for their survival. Meanwhile, I and my 20 men crashed into the frontline Solonians like a landslide. The dozen Solon soldiers, an elite reserve force, resisted fiercely as cornered beasts. The narrow street became a chaotic blur of blades and blood. The bloody skirmish favored the Confort army, whose superior armor, longer weapons, and tighter coordination gradually overwhelmed the Solonians. Roderick led the charge, downing an enemy with a broken spear shaft before seizing a Solon machete to hack through the ranks alongside his men. The Solon unit was annihilated at the cost of 1 dead and several wounded Confort soldiers. The street was littered with over a dozen Solon corpses, the air thick with the stench of blood. Roderick, gasping and wiping grime from his face, checked the rear exit. It was empty. The Solon militia had fled in terror. Joel and 5 musketeers approached, their muskets reloaded and expressions a mix of nerves and pride. Platoon leader. The rear is clear, Joel reported, beaming with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Well done. Roderick clapped Joel's shoulder, a heavy weight lifting from his chest. The gamble had paid off. The rear threat was neutralized, and the flank was secure. Ignoring his exhaustion and the pain of his losses, Roderick roared to his men. No time to rest. Form up. Shield bearers front, spearmen follow, musketeers cover. We're piercing the Solon line from behind to relieve Brendan. For Carnford. Roar. The soldiers' fighting spirit reignited. Fueled by adrenaline and the desire to avenge their fallen, they surged forward. Though thinned and slightly disorganized, the squad was more lethal than ever. Roderick led the battered unit in a desperate charge toward the back of the main Solon line, where the sounds of battle raged. Charge! Kill them all! As I ran, a chilling thought struck me. Brendan's main force, especially Otto's musketeer company, was firing blindly ahead. If they were mistaken for Solon reinforcements, a friendly volley could wipe them out. I broke into a cold sweat. I fumbled for the brass whistle hanging from my neck, the standard signaling tool for Carnford officers. I blew a frantic, prearranged sequence signaling friendly forces. Phew, 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 phew. The piercing whistle cut through the din of battle toward Brendan's lines. Seconds later, a response whistle sounded, and the musketry fire from the main line noticeably faltered and ceased. Otto or his officers had heard the signal and reacted. Good. My confidence returned. Charge. Kill. The Solon archers and infantry, focused entirely on the front, were caught completely off guard. As my men burst from the smoke and shadows, the rearguard Solonians were skewered by spears or hacked down before they could react. Enemies behind. The Southerners are here. The warning came too late. The Solon line collapsed into chaos as soldiers scrambled to turn and face the rear. My squad tore through the disorganized ranks, their spears and blades carving a path through the confusion. Faced with enemies on both sides, the Solon morale shattered, and many fled into nearby houses. However, not all resistance had ceased. A massive Solon soldier in heavy, iron-reinforced leather armor burst from the crowd like a maddened bear. He wielded a heavy battle axe with terrifying ease, swinging it like a whirlwind. Die! The giant roared, bringing his axe down on a Carnford shield-bearer. Crack! Splat! The iron-bound shield was cleaved in two, the blade continuing through the soldier's shoulder and chest, spraying gore. The soldier collapsed, dead instantly. Bastard! I screamed, recognizing the fallen man as a promising recruit. I lunged with my broken spear, aiming for the giant's exposed neck. I struck as the giant recovered from his swing, but I underestimated the veteran's reflexes. The giant caught the spear shaft with his left hand and used his axe to shear off the spearhead with a precise upward strike. Clang! Snap! Sparks flew as the hardwood spear was severed. I was horrified. My weapon was gone, and my opponent was a master of combat. The giant roared and brought the blood-stained axe down toward my face. Survival instinct took over. I knew I couldn't block the blow. I dropped the broken spear and threw myself into a desperate roll to the side. Whoosh! The axe slammed into the stone pavement, sending debris flying and narrowly missing my helmet. As I scrambled to one knee, another threat emerged. A common Solon soldier lunged at the off-balance officer, swinging a machete toward my head. With no time to dodge, I instinctively raised my chainmail-protected arm to block the lethal strike. Asterisk clang. Asterisk. A sharp metallic clang rang out as a Solon soldier's blade struck Roderick's chainmail vambrace. The impact shattered his left forearm, leaving it numb and useless. Had it not been for the chainmail, his arm would have been severed. Even so, the bone was broken, and the agony nearly made him faint. The Solon soldier, surprised the arm hadn't been severed, surged with renewed killing intent. He raised his blade again to finish off the struggling Carnford officer. Kneeling and incapacitated, Roderick watched the blade rise, sensing his impending death. A wave of despair washed over him. Was this the end? At that critical moment, a dull thud echoed. A spear pierced the Solon soldier from behind. His movements froze, his expression shifting from ferocity to shock and pain. He looked down to see the bloodstained spearhead protruding from his chest. The spear was ripped back, trailing blood and viscera. The soldier collapsed, his blade clattering to the ground as he fell dead at Roderick's feet. Roderick looked up to see a young soldier, panting and covered in soot, holding the blood-slicked spear. Though he didn't recognize the youth, he saw the main Conford force charging forward, and the young soldier joined the fray. Heart pounding, Roderick felt his own pain recede in the adrenaline of survival. He grimaced, picked up the dead soldier's blade with his good hand, and struggled to his feet to follow the charge. Roderick's vanguard and Brendan's main force formed a pincer, trapping the remaining Solon archers and infantry in the street. With no retreat, the cornered Solonians turned desperate and feral. Abandoning fear, they fought like wounded beasts. The battle turned brutal. Despite their numerical advantage, the Conford soldiers struggled against the enemy's suicidal resistance. A Solon warrior wielding a heavy battle axe became the greatest threat. Protected by thick armor, he rampaged through the narrow street. He charged into clusters of Conford soldiers, shattering shields and men alike. Veterans avoided him, relying on spears and muskets, but lead balls merely dented his heavy armor. "Stop him! Hold him down!" a Conford sergeant roared. "Go! Kill him!" 3 or 4 sturdy veterans rushed the warrior, using their bodies and shields to pin his limbs. Some were struck down, but 2 managed to grapple the warrior's legs and waist, stalling him. "Stab the gaps in his armor," someone screamed. A veteran with a short sword lunged from the side, driving his blade into the tiny gap between the warrior's armpit and chest plate. The warrior stiffened, his axe swinging halted. He looked down at the sword tip emerging from his armpit, his battle axe falling to the ground. As the Conford soldiers released him, the warrior collapsed like a falling tower, dead. With their strongest fighter gone, the remaining Solonians were quickly slaughtered by the superior Conford force. Silence returned to the street, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of fire. Brendan walked into the center of the carnage. He surveyed the piles of corpses with a heavy heart. The 1st Battalion had suffered 15 casualties, a heavy price that delayed their momentum and gave the castle defenders time to regroup. These are all veterans, Brendan thought, pained. Every loss was a permanent blow to their combat effectiveness, and replacements were impossible to train quickly. He rubbed his brow, frustrated by the cost of the victory. He spotted the bloodied, pale Roderick, whose vanguard had lost half its men. "Roderick!" Brendan barked. Roderick turned to salute, but Brendan waved him off. "Take your remaining men to the back gate," Brendan ordered. "Seal it. Do not let a single Solonian escape, even if it costs your lives." Roderick's heart sank. His unit was exhausted, wounded, and depleted. To order them to hold the gate was essentially a suicide mission. Yet, seeing Brendan's cold, uncompromising gaze, he knew resistance was futile. "Yes, sir," Roderick rasped. "Move," Brendan shouted. Roderick gathered his dozen remaining, battered men and limped toward the back gate, leaving their fallen comrades behind. The path ahead was chaotic. Solon soldiers and civilians fled in panic, abandoning their weapons. Sporadic gunfire echoed as other Conford units mopped up the remaining resistance. Along the way, Roderick's unit encountered groups of Solon cavalry galloping in retreat. These riders, theoretically the most mobile and dangerous force in the castle, were now in full flight. Seeing Roderick's exhausted, disorganized squad, the Solon cavalry didn't attack. Instead, they panicked and spurred their horses toward the castle's rear gate. They whipped their mounts, fleeing in a cloud of dust without looking back. Their faces betrayed pure terror and a total loss of fighting spirit. Clearly, the Conford army's superior firearms, formations, and urban warfare prowess had shattered the Solonians' will to fight. Lords, castles, and honor meant nothing compared to survival. To them, the castle belonged to the lord, but their lives were their own. Why die here when they could flee to another territory? Seeing them run, Roderick looked at his own battered men and signaled a halt. "Squad leader? Why stop?" "Brendan ordered us to block the rear gate," Elton asked, confused. Gritting his teeth, Roderick reached for the leather pouch at his waist, his fingers brushing a small, cold glass bottle. Inside was a dark red potion, distinct from the pale red of standard militia potion. He bit off the stopper, spat it out, and downed the liquid. The spicy, herbal potion took effect instantly. Warmth flooded his fractured left arm, and the agonizing pain receded as feeling returned to his numb fingertips. This was a rare, improved formula gifted by Conrad, boasting higher potency and fewer side effects. Thanks to Edgar's production line upgrades, these were now standard issue for every soldier. These improved militia potions had saved countless lives, keeping casualty rates at an all-time low. Feeling his arm improve, Roderick pointed at the fleeing Solonians and then at his 10 remaining men. "Use your head, Elton. We're wounded. How can we block the gate? If we stand in their way, they'll fight to the death. If we force them into a corner, they'll tear us apart. I don't want to die, and neither should you." Elton hesitated, still worried about Brendan's orders. "Orders are rigid, but we are alive," Roderick interrupted, thinking fast. He surveyed the street. The rear gate plaza was ahead, with a massive wooden gatehouse spilling out a flood of retreating Solon soldiers. They were still some distance from the gate. "Who says we have to block the gate itself?" Roderick told his men. "Brendan just said to stop them from escaping. We establish a defensive line here." He stomped on the cobblestones. "We intercept and shoot them from here. It's safer and gives us room to maneuver." He ordered, "Musketeers, take the windows and corners. Archers, fire at will. Shield bearers and spearmen, form a defensive line to prevent any desperate charges." The soldiers agreed. This was far better than a suicide mission at the gate. They were still executing the order, just more effectively. 2 musketeers and Joel kicked open a nearby house, occupying the second-floor windows. Elton and another archer grabbed bows scavenged from Solon corpses. The remaining men formed a thin, makeshift defensive line in the street. As the first wave of Solonians entered range, Roderick ordered, "Fire at will." A crisp shot rang out from Joel's musket. A Solon cavalryman and his horse were struck by the lead ball. The horse shrieked and collapsed, throwing the rider. The remaining soldiers scrambled around the wreckage. Elton fired a scavenged bow with all his might. The arrow struck a fleeing soldier in the back. Lacking force, the arrow only pierced the leather armor slightly. The soldier stumbled but kept running, disappearing into the darkness outside the gate. "Damn it," Elton cursed, his arms too tired to draw again. Roderick and the others kept firing, but their efforts were sporadic. Their weak, scattered fire was like throwing pebbles into an ocean against the massive tide of retreating Solonians. They caused minor chaos, but couldn't stop the flood. The open gate acted like a black hole, swallowing the panicked Solon army. Roderick felt helpless, knowing they had reached their limit. Just as he considered a symbolic advance, a thunderous roar echoed from behind. "Roderick!" The voice was terrifyingly familiar. Roderick froze and turned. Brendan marched toward them, his armor stained with blood and soot, eyes burning with rage, followed by a battle-hardened squad from the 1st Battalion. Brendan stomped up to Roderick, shouting, "I ordered you to block the gate. What the hell are you doing? Look at how many you've let escape." Roderick felt a tremor of fear, but forced himself to stay calm. He knew excuses would only make it worse. He needed facts. He lowered his head, feigning sincerity. "Sir, we are too few and all wounded. Joel has an arrow in his shoulder, Elton is exhausted, and I." He lifted his limp, swollen, and clearly fractured left arm. "My arm is broken. If we had tried to block the gate, we would have been slaughtered instantly. We are doing our best to pick them off from here, which is the most we can do." Brendan's gaze swept over the battered, exhausted men and finally rested on Roderick's mangled arm. The injury was undeniable proof of a hard fight. Brendan's rage cooled, replaced by a deep frown. He realized that ordering a handful of wounded men to hold the gate had indeed been an impossible, suicidal task. Roderick chose to defend from his current position. While he let some enemies escape, he preserved his veteran corps and inflicted significant casualties. Militarily, this was a pragmatic decision to prioritize survival and attrition over the literal order to hold the back gate at all costs. Seeing Roderick's pale, pained face and his battered men, Brendan's anger softened into a stern reprimand. "Enough with the pity. What are your casualties?" "4 dead, 3 incapacitated, and the rest are wounded. My arm is broken, and Joel took an arrow to the shoulder, Roderick reported. Brendan waved him off. Stay here. Keep firing at the fleeing enemy. Not one step back without my orders. Yes, sir. Roderick stood tall, relieved that Brendan had tacitly accepted his tactical deviation without further punishment. Brendan turned to his main force, drew his sword, and roared, "Follow me. Target the back gate. Seal it shut. No one gets out. Charge. Kill." Brendan led his fresh troops like a tiger, surging past Roderick's line toward the back gate plaza. The blue-clad wave engulfed the plaza, systematically crushing and encircling the fleeing Solonians. Watching them go, Roderick exhaled, his back soaked in cold sweat. He looked at his exhausted men, who were finally breathing a sigh of relief. Roderick wiped his brow and whispered to his men, particularly Elton, "I just saved your lives. If we had followed the order to block the gate, we'd all be corpses by now." The soldiers looked at him with newfound respect and gratitude. His insubordination had indeed prevented unnecessary sacrifice. Brendan's main force quickly secured the back gate and its surroundings. Shield bearers and spearmen formed a solid wall across all exits. Otto's musketeer company lined up behind them, unleashing lethal volleys at the trapped Solon cavalry. Bang! Bang, bang, bang. Lead shot rained down through the smoke. The Solon cavalry's charge collapsed. After leaving dozens of dead behind, the survivors retreated in despair. The back gate was sealed. The only path to survival was cut off. The remaining Solonians fell into a frantic, desperate state, scurrying through the castle. Some found secret tunnels or cellars, vanishing like rats. Others, in their panic, climbed the crumbling walls and leaped into the void. Screams and the sound of breaking bones echoed as they hit the ground or water below. Most simply hid in the alleys, weeping and waiting for their fate. Brendan adjusted his deployment. First Company, assist Otto's musketeers in holding the gate. He then led the second and third companies along the walls to clear the remaining enemies and link up with the center. Roland's 3rd Battalion had already secured the main streets and intersections. They began infiltrating the complex alleys and houses. Despite the new recruits' lack of experience and occasional ambushes, their superior numbers and firepower ground down the resistance. The sounds of battle gradually faded across the castle. Nayland Castle was mostly in Carnford hands, save for the Lord's Keep. The massive stone tower stood silent, like a wounded beast baring its final fangs. It was the Solon Lord's final refuge and the hardest nut to crack. Brendan's 1st Battalion swept the inner walls efficiently. With their command structure shattered, the Solon remnants offered little resistance. Pockets of resistance were quickly eliminated, and the wall area was cleared within an hour. Meanwhile, 3rd Battalion squads branched out from the main street to clear the alleys. They followed urban warfare protocols, searching house by house. Despite occasional sniper fire from cellars and attics, their methodical tactics cleared the resistance. The sounds of war were replaced by the shouting of soldiers, kicking in doors, and the occasional execution. As sunset bathed Nayland Castle in blood, the Carnford army held the perimeter and main streets. Survivors retreated into the Lord's Keep, relying on its thick walls for a final stand. Others hid in cellars and storage rooms, trembling as they awaited judgment. I entered the castle, stepping over rubble and blood-soaked ground. The air was thick with the scent of death, fire, and fear. I observed the battlefield, where soldiers were tending to the wounded and clearing the dead. Brendan and Roland arrived to report. "My lord," Brendan saluted, exhausted but sharp-eyed. "The walls and perimeter are cleared. We are consolidating. The Lord's Keep is surrounded, but they are still resisting inside." Roland added, "The center is secure, and we are mopping up the alleys. Prisoners and loot are being tallied." I nodded. "Casualties?" Brendan replied grimly, "Roughly 40 dead, 60 incapacitated, and nearly 100 lightly wounded. Total casualties near 200. The number was heavy, though it was a brilliant victory compared to the cost of a full-scale siege. For the Carnford new army of 3,000, losing 200 men, including many veteran leaders, was a significant blow. I fell silent after hearing the report. I looked toward the towering, silent Lord's Keep and the corpses of both sides littering the blood-stained ground. War never comes without bloodshed. While the cost was within my expectations, I still felt heavy-hearted. Every casualty represented a life and a family. I quickly suppressed these emotions, knowing a lord must weigh gains and losses with a cool head. The cost is worth it, I said firmly. We've taken Nayland Castle, removed the biggest thorn in our side, secured supplies and population, tempered our troops, and intimidated the Solon tribes. 200 casualties is a fair trade. Ensure the fallen and wounded are properly compensated and treated. Return the lightly wounded to duty as soon as possible. Understood, Brendan and Roland replied. As for that stone fortress, I pointed to the besieged keep. It's too sturdy for a direct assault without heavy losses. Keep it surrounded and cut off their supplies. Our priority is to consolidate the outer areas and clear out the remaining Solon soldiers and civilians hiding in the houses. My gaze sharpened. We won't send soldiers house to house to kill. That would force the desperate inhabitants to fight back with kitchen knives and clubs, causing unnecessary casualties. We must resolve this with minimal cost. Brendan and Roland listened intently, trusting their lord's strategy. I instructed Brendan. We will use the boiling frog strategy to break their will and make them walk out themselves. First, have soldiers announce in the streets that the Carnford army spares civilians. Anyone who reports hidden Solon soldiers will be safe. Those who hide them will face the same fate as the soldiers. Give them hope while sowing distrust between civilians and soldiers. Execute all surrendered soldiers secretly outside the city. Second, I continued, once the soldiers are cleared, demand all civilians surrender every weapon, swords, axes, bows, even kitchen knives, at designated points. Declare that anyone caught with weapons after the deadline will be executed for rebellion. Collect and destroy or transport these weapons. Third, I said coldly, demand they surrender half their gold, valuables, and food reserves as compensation for our campaign and proof of their sincerity. Merged with 23360, by escalating from soldiers to weapons, then to wealth, we keep dangling the promise of survival. They will cling to hope, betray each other to survive, and slowly abandon their capacity for resistance. Brendan and Roland understood perfectly. By the time they were penniless and starving, they would be like frogs boiled to death, lacking the strength to jump. Then, the Carnford soldiers could enter to manage the population and arrest them without a fight. Whether they were sent to mines as slaves or executed would depend entirely on the Lord's needs. By promising safety while systematically draining them, they could be conquered at their weakest. This avoided dangerous house-to-house clearing and minimized casualties. The Solonians would walk into the abyss, clinging to a pathetic hope until the very end. Brendan was awestruck by the ruthless efficiency of the plan. It was far more civilized and safer than a massacre, yet likely more effective. Brilliant, my lord, Brendan saluted. I will see to it that every last rat is invited out. Go. Be firm, but keep up the facade. The announcers must sound sincere, the registration official, and the execution secret. Heat the water slowly. Brendan acknowledged the order and strode away. My month-long, ruthless sweep of the Nayland territory was conducted with strict information control. However, such large-scale destruction of Solon strongholds inevitably sent ripples through the region. It eventually caught the attention of major Solon powers. The nearest significant Solon stronghold was the Golden City, 150 kilometers to the northeast. The Golden City originated centuries ago from a rich gold vein. Prospectors and merchants flocked there, building camps that eventually merged into a town. Merged with 23381. During the gold rush, the city was prosperous and bustling. But after centuries of mining, the veins dried up and the prosperity faded. During the chaos of the Plantagenet kingdom's retreat and the Solon expansion, the city was sacked and slaughtered, leading to rapid decline. Today, the Golden City is a dilapidated ruin with few residents. Once strategically unimportant, its status changed. Merged with 23387. After Harold's defeat at Carnford and his retreat to Frostguard, he did not abandon his southern ambitions and reinforced his borders. The Golden City, positioned on the route to Carnford, was reevaluated for its military value. Harold ordered reinforcements to bolster the city's defenses. Now, 20,000 Solon soldiers are stationed in and around the Golden City. though most are second-line troops and militia of varying quality. Still, the sheer number serves as a powerful deterrent. The small, ruined city couldn't house them all. Thus, the main force is stationed at Squirrel Town, 15 kilometers northeast. Squirrel Town, once a trade hub, offered more space for camps. The Solan army requisitioned all usable buildings for officers and elite troops. The bulk of the soldiers set up endless tents in the surrounding fields and forests. The camp stretches for kilometers, a massive, menacing display of military might. To monitor the south, the Solan army established a dense network of outposts, watchtowers, and patrols. These sentries were tasked with monitoring Carnford around the clock and reporting any movement. The saying, "soldiers are like bandits," held true for the people under Solonian rule. When the 20,000-strong Solan army occupied Squirrel Town and its surroundings, the local residents, both Plantagenet remnants and Solonian civilians, were terrified. Knowing the discipline of these troops, most fled before the army arrived, leaving the town largely deserted. Those who remained were either the destitute or those forced to serve the military. The refugees scattered in all directions. Some fled south toward the Solonian borderlands, where the Carnford army was sweeping, only to fall straight into Karl's death storm. They met only cold steel, enslavement, or death. Their flight added to Karl's battle results and brought chaotic, vague reports of trouble to the Solonian command. At sunset, the sky turned a bloody crimson as the sun dipped behind the western mountains. The Solan camp outside Squirrel Town was shrouded in twilight, lit by flickering campfires. Suddenly, a scout on horseback galloped from the southern wilderness toward the camp gate at a frantic pace, his horse's hooves thundering like drums. The rider was covered in dust, his armor askew, his face etched with exhaustion and panic. He whipped his mount, screaming hoarsely, "Urgent intelligence! Urgent intelligence! Report to the commander immediately!" His voice echoed ominously across the plains. Solonian guards at the gate were alerted by the commotion and immediately formed a defensive line. The captain, a scarred veteran, watched the approaching scout with suspicion, his hand on his scimitar. 23,419 halt, the captain roared. Password, halt, the captain roared, his voice cutting through the thundering hooves. Password, 23,421. Military rules dictated that anyone approaching at night must provide the password or face immediate detention or execution as a potential spy. Failure to provide the correct password, or any hesitation, granted the guards authority to detain or execute the rider on the spot as a suspected spy or assassin, with no exceptions. The scout reined in his horse, which reared and neighed. He gasped, "Thor. The password is Thor. Sir, it's urgent. Something major happened at Carnford. Take me to the commander at once, or we'll all be responsible for the consequences." The captain's wariness eased slightly upon hearing the correct password, but he did not grant entry yet. He scrutinized the scout's gear, the horse's brand, and his genuine state of exhaustion before signaling his men. 2 guards pulled the scout from his horse. One held the horse while the other performed a professional, invasive search for weapons or suspicious items, checking the scout's vitals to ensure he wasn't injured or compromised. The process was swift and ruthless. Satisfied that the scout was legitimate and unarmed, the captain finally waved him through. "Go in. The commander is in the main tent. Don't wander," the captain ordered. "Thank you." The scout remounted and galloped toward the main banner, leaving a trail of dust. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that such frantic behavior from a scout rarely signaled good news. Was Carnford launching a major offensive? The scout raced through the camp, struggling to maintain speed while avoiding patrols. 23,436. He passed several checkpoints, repeatedly showing his token and answering the password. At every checkpoint, I quickly presented my token, recited the password, and briefly explained my mission while enduring the guard's suspicious scrutiny. Despite his urgent status, the layers of security consumed precious time. Finally, he reached the command center in the heart of Squirrel Town. It was a grand merchant's mansion, now somewhat dilapidated. Legion Commander Gordon of the Rain Legion had seized it as his headquarters and residence. He had also claimed the former owner's wife and daughters as his playthings. The mansion was eerily quiet, save for the swaying lanterns and patrolling guards. The main hall was brightly lit. Gordon, a middle-aged Solonian general with a sinister face and short beard, stood before a large map of the region. The map marked the Golden City, Squirrel Town, Blackwater River, Grey Wolf Valley, Nayland Castle, and various Solonian outposts. He tapped his fingers on the table, his brow furrowed. Being stationed in this desolate, harsh borderland was, in Gordon's eyes, a form of exile. While other high-ranking Solonian generals enjoyed the spoils of the Plantagenet campaign, living in villas, drinking fine wine, and keeping young Plantagenet captives, Gordon was stuck in this ruin. He was forced to manage logistics and deal with sweaty, crude subordinates. Even his spoils here were inferior to the trained slaves he kept on his own estates. Damn it, Gordon cursed. He knew his situation was a result of his political alignment. He was a loyalist to Ulf, whose mission to surround Carnford had ended in a humiliating failure. Ulf had failed Harold's mission, lost troops, and required reinforcements to stabilize the front. Upon his return, Harold had stripped Ulf of his titles and command. As a staunch supporter, Gordon was inevitably implicated. Though he escaped severe punishment, he had been demoted, sidelined, and effectively cast into the periphery. Being reassigned from a prosperous, central region to the cold, dangerous, and resource-poor Golden City front was a clear demotion for Gordon. Though titled Commander-in-Chief, his actual authority was severely restricted. He lacked full command over the field legions, requiring constant coordination. His 20,000 troops were mostly second-line garrison forces suited only for construction and defense. He could only directly command a few hundred personal guards. The position was stifling and humiliating. While Gordon brooded over his map, a guard in fine leather armor entered and whispered, "Commander, scouts from the Blackwater River Valley have returned with urgent news." Gordon's fingers froze. He turned, eyes sharp. "Blackwater River? Urgent? Send him in." The guard retreated. Gordon felt a surge of alarm. Blackwater River was his primary defensive line against the southern Carnford. His vigilance stemmed from deep-seated fear of the Carnford people. During the battle at Carnford earlier that year, the Rain Legion had served as a flanking force. The Carnford garrison's fierce resistance and bizarre tactics, which even Harold failed to overcome, left Gordon with lasting psychological trauma. He knew that if he were the Lord of Carnford, he would capitalize on that defensive victory to clear border threats and launch an offensive. Consequently, he had never relaxed his surveillance of Carnford. Have they finally moved? Gordon's heart raced with dread. Two guards brought in the panicked, travel-worn scout. The scout collapsed to his knees, trembling. "Commander, disaster. Refugees are fleeing from Blackwater River, Grey Wolf Valley, and Nayland Castle. The Carnford army is sweeping through the forests. Grey Wolf Valley and Blackwater River have fallen. Nayland Castle is under siege. Carnford soldiers are everywhere, killing, looting, and taking slaves. There's blood and fire everywhere. They're well-equipped, have cavalry, and the local lords can't stop them." The scout's report was fragmented by terror. Yet, the core facts were clear. The Carnford army had launched a border offensive and breached multiple strongholds, including Nayland Castle. Gordon turned pale, his hand gripping his chair until it shook. His worst fears were realized. The speed of their advance was terrifying. Even the stone-walled Nayland Castle had been surrounded. How many troops did they have? Had their combat power increased since the siege? A chill ran down his spine. He envisioned the deep blue Carnford banners marching toward Golden City and Squirrel Town. How many of his 20,000 men could stand against the Carnford's terrifying weapons and disciplined formations? "Order," Gordon commanded, his voice trembling with suppressed shock. "Summon all Kiliarchs and above for an emergency council. Send out all scouts. I need to know their numbers, location, and commander immediately." The council hall was soon ablaze with torches. Over a dozen officers arrived. Their expressions varied. Some were still in armor, others were groggy from sleep, but most were anxious, sensing the gravity of the midnight summons. The atmosphere was stifling. Gordon sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold, sharp intensity. The scout, now calmer after a drink, stood to the side, though fear still lingered in his eyes. "Everyone is here," Gordon said coldly. "Scout, repeat your report from the beginning." No exaggerations, no omissions. Yes, Commander, the scout replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. 7 or 8 days ago, refugees from Grey Wolf Valley began appearing. They said Con Ford had attacked long ago. A month ago, hunters in Grey Wolf Valley began disappearing, only to be found dead with arrow wounds and trap marks. Lord Derek began preparing, reinforcing fences, and buying weapons. It was useless. Conford's cavalry and archers were too precise. Our lines were decimated before they could even engage. The infantry finished them off. Grey Wolf Valley fell. Lord Derek is likely dead. Refugees flooded in. Fox Valley and Owl Creek also fell. The Conford army is unstoppable, burning, looting, and enslaving everyone in their path. The latest news, the scouts swallowed hard, is that Nayland Castle is surrounded. They have many banners and encampments. It's a massive force. Yesterday afternoon, my own post was attacked by Conford cavalry. They were fast and precise. I'm the only one who escaped to report this. Silence descended upon the hall, broken only by the crackling torches. The officers were stunned. This was no mere raid, but a full-scale, organized conquest. A string of border outposts had been erased, and now Nayland Castle was under siege. This was territorial expansion. Gordon walked to the large map on the wall. My finger traced the path of the invasion. I stopped at Nayland Castle. A clear line of advance from the southwest to the northeast was visible, ending at the castle. Nayland Castle was clearly the primary objective of this sweep. Capturing it would grant Conford a solid forward base and clear the Solon forces from the entire mountain region. A sweep, Gordon muttered, staring at the red line on the map before turning to his officers. A calm, authoritative voice broke the silence in the hall. This is a calculated sweep. The Conford forces are precise and swift. They aren't just raiding. They are retaliating. They are responding to our great leader's order to hunt their hunters and farmers. We took their lives and goods. Now they return the favor with interest. The speaker was Galash, a young man of about 25 with the sharp, experienced gaze of a seasoned veteran. Dressed in simple iron-studded leather armor with a curved blade at his waist, he stood out among the officers. Gordon looked at Galash, his expression shifting from annoyance to a mix of gravity and wariness. Galash was a battle commander under the Wolf Legion, a rank far below Gordon's status as a Legion commander. Ordinarily, he would be the last to speak before the commander-in-chief and the Kiliarchs. However, Gordon dared not slight him, for Galash was the son-in-law of Sven. Sven, commander of the Wolf Legion and brother to the great leader Harold, held immense power and influence, far eclipsing Gordon, who was merely a relocated commander of the Rain Legion. Galash's rise wasn't just nepotism. He was a protege personally trained by Sven. In the Solon army, strength is paramount, and Galash had proven his worth. His tactical flexibility and bravery during the raids on the Plantagenet heartlands earlier this year solidified his reputation as a capable commander. His presence at the Golden City was likely Sven's way of monitoring Gordon or establishing a foothold for the Wolf Legion. Consequently, Galash's words carried significant weight for Gordon. His analysis pointed toward the strategic implications of the Solon High Command's decisions, leaving Gordon deep in thought. Gordon nodded slowly. Your analysis is sound, Galash. This is more than mere revenge. They are using blood and iron to draw a new border in the Northern Territory, with Nayland Castle as their marker. Gordon stared at the map, his voice hardening. The question is, how long can Nayland Castle hold? What should we do? Galash ignored the broad question, focusing instead on the terrified scout. How many men does the Conford army have? He asked calmly. The question was vital. The enemy's strength dictated the scale of the threat and the necessary response. The scout hesitated, clearly panicked. He struggled to recall the chaos of the refugees and his own flight, having seen little through the smoke and confusion. I don't know, sir. Some said hundreds, others said thousands. It was a sea of black. It was too chaotic, with smoke and screaming everywhere. Under the piercing gaze of Galash and the hostile stares of the Kiliarchs, his fear intensified. He knelt, kowtowing desperately. I'm just a scout. I barely escaped with my life to deliver this message. I swear I saw no clear numbers. Galash didn't press him further. seemingly expecting the lack of clarity. He looked away, rubbing his chin in deep thought. His face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, showed a mind rapidly calculating the situation. The entire hall fell silent, all eyes fixed on Galosh, including Gordon's. The young commander's next move would dictate the fate of the entire army. The silence stretched for over 10 seconds. Finally, Galosh looked up at the large parchment map on the wall. He pointed precisely to a small, previously overlooked marker near Grey Wolf Valley. "I recall," Galosh said, his voice echoing, "that we still have an encampment on Grey Wolf Mountain." Gordon's pupils constricted as he looked at the spot. There it was, a small triangle marking a military outpost on Grey Wolf Mountain. Gordon knew of it, but had dismissed it as bypassed or already overrun during his initial assessment. "The Grey Wolf Mountain Camp," Gordon exclaimed, rushing to his desk to find the relevant records. He quickly found the entry, Grey Wolf Mountain Camp, 3rd Garrison of the Rain Legion, 1,130 men under Battle Commander Old Barton. They are self-sufficient, fortified on the mountain, and receive periodic supplies. Primary mission: monitor Grey Wolf Valley and the Blackwater River, guarding against Plantagenet incursions. Gordon looked at Galosh, finally grasping his line of reasoning. Galosh tapped the map with a cold, knowing smile. "Interesting. We haven't heard reports of any large-scale retreat from that direction, have we?" He turned his gaze back to the trembling scout, his presence now imposing. "Tell me," Galosh commanded. "Did you see or hear of any organized units of Solon soldiers retreating from Grey Wolf Mountain? Yes or no?" The scout swallowed hard. "No, sir. Absolutely not. I only saw civilians in rags and a few scattered militia. No organized regular army units. Not a single one." A short-tempered Chiliarch kicked the scout, growling. "Think carefully. Your life depends on the truth." The scout nodded frantically. "I swear on my life, sir. Only refugees and stragglers, no regular troops." Galosh looked away from the scout, his mission seemingly complete. He turned to the officers, pointing at Grey Wolf Mountain on the map. "This proves the Carnford army ignored the Grey Wolf Mountain barracks entirely. Why? Either they failed to take it, or they deemed it unworthy of their time. Had they attacked, we would have seen casualties or retreating soldiers. We received no such reports. The second possibility," Galosh said sharply, "is that they were arrogant enough to believe the 500 defenders posed no threat. They ignored the barracks to strike at a higher value target, Nayland Castle." He traced their route from Grey Wolf Valley to Nayland Castle. "The Carnford army moved with speed, exploiting our weak border territories. Their combat effectiveness in field maneuvers is stronger than anticipated. However," Galosh's tone hardened, "they've made a fatal error. Either their commander is a fool, or that boy I have become dangerously arrogant." He pointed to Nayland Castle. "With its dual-layered defenses and the Lord's Keep, they cannot breach it quickly without heavy siege equipment or overwhelming numbers. They will be bogged down in a protracted siege, draining their resources. This is our chance." Galosh drew a line between Grey Wolf Valley and Nayland Castle, a metaphorical noose. "My plan: first, send a messenger with Commander Gordon's orders to Old Barton at the Grey Wolf Mountain Barracks. He must leave a skeleton crew and lead his main force to occupy and fortify the now empty Grey Wolf Valley. They must turn the valley into a spike that cuts off the Carnford army's retreat. Second, we mobilize 3,000 troops from Squirrel Town. With me or Commander Gordon leading, we march to relieve Nayland Castle. Third, whether the castle has fallen or is still holding, our arrival will force the Carnford army into a pincer movement. They will be forced to either fight a losing battle or retreat in panic. As they flee back toward Grey Wolf Valley, they will run straight into Old Barton's rested elite force. The valley will be their graveyard. Trapped between our main force and the fortified valley, they will have nowhere to turn." Galosh slammed the map. "We will crush this arrogant Carnford army and potentially annihilate them between the valley and the castle. That is the gift we send to that naive boy me." Galosh finished his lethal, logically sound plan. The hall fell silent, save for the crackling torches and heavy breathing. The officers were stunned by the audacity of the pincer maneuver. Success would mean a glorious victory, restoring honor and elevating Galosh's status. Gordon remained silent. The plan was tactically sound, but he felt a heavy weight in his chest. Could the Grey Wolf Mountain troops actually execute this? Galash was a tactical genius, but he lacked knowledge of the local garrison's state. The young commander didn't realize the reality of those barracks. On paper, there were over 1,000 men, but Gordon knew barely 500 were fit for combat. Worse, these mountain troops had long since devolved into simple farmers. They were fine for chores, but expecting them to drop their hoes for swords and launch an offensive was a stretch. Gordon doubted they could deliver the thunderous strike Galash envisioned. Yet, seeing Galash's enthusiasm, he swallowed his objections. Gordon stared at the map, his mind racing. He weighed the risks and benefits. If the plan failed, he would only lose 500 idle soldiers who were doing nothing anyway. The worst-case scenario was me catching wind of the plan and escaping, leaving them with a wasted march. Even then, it would be a valuable lesson for the young commander. Galash had talent, but Gordon remained responsible for Carnford's defense. Sometimes, one must stumble to understand the difference between theory and the battlefield. Gordon relaxed his face and looked at Galash. Battle Commander Galash, how confident are you? Galash smiled sharply. If Old Barton holds the valley and we strike with speed, I am 70% certain of success. Seeing the burning confidence in Galash's eyes, Gordon laughed and slammed his hand on the map. Fine, we do it. Orders, Gordon commanded. First, send the fastest messengers to Grey Wolf Mountain with joint orders for Old Barton. He must act immediately. Second, full mobilization. Kiliarchs, return to your camps. Check gear and supplies. I want the army ready at dawn. Third, deploy all scouts toward Nayland Castle to monitor the Carnford army. This battle concerns the honor of the Solon warriors. Work together and crush the enemy. Yes, the officers shouted, their eyes burning with battle lust. At the Nayland Castle Lord's Keep, the once sturdy stone walls were ruined. After a day and night of precise bombardment, several breaches had been torn into the west and south walls. The largest breach, wide enough for several men, revealed the dark, smoke-filled interior of the Lord's Keep through jagged, debris-strewn edges. The side of the fortress facing the Carnford army looked as if it had been hammered by a giant, its walls spider-webbed with cracks and sagging in multiple places. Boom! Another deafening roar echoed as a scorching iron ball slammed into the base of an intact arrow tower atop the fortress. With a thunderous crash, the tower collapsed inward, burying sentries under a rain of stone and dust. The bombardment had begun the moment the Carnford army cleared the perimeter and encircled the Lord's Keep. For a full day and night, 3 minion cannons took turns delivering this lethal, bone-chilling thunder. Initially, the Solon soldiers attempted to hold their ground, relying on interior fortifications, rooms, and hidden tunnels. They hoped to lure the Carnford army into a brutal urban warfare engagement once the walls were breached. However, the Carnford commander had other plans. Artillery became the centerpiece of the siege. Cannonballs smashed into the interior, treating the complex structures designed for close-quarters defense like paper toys. Carefully prepared firing ports, ambushes, and narrow passages were pulverized and blocked by relentless fire. The labyrinth meant to bleed the invaders dry was now a death trap of ruins. The foundation of urban warfare had been dismantled, and morale plummeted with every strike. The soldiers feared not a fair fight, but the invisible, random death brought by the falling iron. Being blown to pieces while sleeping, eating, or tending to basic needs created a psychological terror that no blade could match. The constant shelling eroded their will as much as it destroyed the fortress walls. The uncertainty of the next strike acted like a Damocles sword, far more debilitating than direct combat. To escape the fire, survivors and the wounded retreated to the dark, damp dungeons and storage rooms at the base of the fortress. The environment was wretched, thick with the stench of mold, blood, and excrement. The freezing stone walls sapped their remaining warmth and courage. Doomed soldiers lay in corners, their untreated wounds festering, their muffled groans echoing through the silence. These sounds tormented the minds of all who remained conscious. The lord of the castle, wrapped in a tattered fur, leaned against the cold wall, his face pale and eyes hollow. Watching the misery and hearing the distant artillery, he felt his hope turn to ice. His final strategy, the fortress's complex layout, had been brutally negated. With morale broken, the wounded dying, and supplies nearly gone, further resistance seemed utterly pointless. Outside, the Conford army had finished clearing the perimeter with unexpected ease. Using my boiling the frog strategy of threats and incentives, the Conford soldiers forced the Solon civilians and stragglers into submission. They surrendered hidden Solon soldiers, who were promptly executed, and handed over anything that could serve as a weapon. Finally, under the guise of requisitioning, they surrendered their remaining food and valuables. Gathered in the castle square, starving and disarmed, they were left with nothing but numb despair. I did not order a massacre, instead keeping the captives under tight guard in cleared buildings and cellars. Their fate, whether as slaves or forced laborers, would be decided only after the Lord's keep was fully secured. At the Conford main camp outside the castle, I stood on a rise, observing Elmont direct another round of artillery fire through his telescope. Boom! The cannons spat fire, sending shells into the ruins of the Lord's keep, triggering further collapse. I lowered my telescope, lost in thought. I viewed this bombardment not just as a means to force surrender, but as a rare live-fire training exercise for my artillery. "Sir, the barrels are overheating," Elmont reported, wiping sweat from his brow. "We need to let them cool." "Proceed as planned," I nodded. I knew the limitations of the minion cannon. These short-barreled iron guns lacked the heat dissipation of bronze or advanced falconets. After 3 to 5 rounds, they reached dangerous temperatures and required a cooling period. They could not be doused with cold water to avoid cracking, meaning the firing rate was agonizingly slow. "If only we had long-barreled falconets," Elmont muttered. "We could turn this stone turtle shell into rubble in an hour." "We will," I replied calmly, though I knew a more pressing issue. We were running out of ammunition. Despite thorough preparations, the constant shelling of Nayland Castle had consumed a staggering amount of iron shot. The piles of ammunition crates near the artillery position had noticeably dwindled. Elmont had reported that at the current rate, they had at most 5 volleys left. I frowned, looking at the ruined fortress. Its defenses were shattered, but the structure stood, and the defenders had yet to raise a white flag. A direct assault was possible, but it would be costly and unpredictable. I hoped for a surrender to preserve my troops and salvage the castle's remaining resources. Now, it's a test of endurance, I thought. Would the Solonians break under hunger and fear first, or would I be forced to assault when the shells ran dry? I knew my time was limited. My campaign through the Solon borderlands had been high-profile and disruptive. Such actions could not go unnoticed by the Solon authorities forever. I wondered about the status of the Golden City, the nearest, most powerful Solon stronghold, and whether they were already mobilizing a counterattack. I worried about the unknown, as intelligence from my scouts was delayed. I also fretted over Oliver. I had tasked Oliver with holding Grey Wolf Valley with a militia company and laborers to monitor the Solon soldiers on Grey Wolf Mountain and secure the army's rear. Grey Wolf Valley was their vital supply line and the most likely point for an enemy ambush. Could Oliver hold with only 100 men against a professional Solon force? I gazed southwest toward the valley, my expression heavy with concern. My expeditionary force was a sword thrust deep into enemy territory, leaving its own flanks and rear dangerously exposed. Time had become a cruel, precious commodity for both sides. At dusk, the blood-red sunset cast a grim, golden-red hue over the dense forests of Grey Wolf Mountain. A horseman raced frantically up the rugged mountain path. The rider leaned low, whipping his mount with desperate intensity. The warhorse was drenched in sweat, white foam dripping from its mouth. Its chest heaved like a bellows, and its gait was stumbling, driven only by momentum and the rider's urgency. Upon reaching a flatter slope, the rider spotted the rough wooden and stone fortifications of the camp. The loyal horse let out a final whinny, collapsed, and tumbled to the ground, throwing the rider into the dust. "Halt!" a voice barked from the watchtower. Solon guards in tattered leather armor emerged, weapons raised, eyeing the intruder with caution. Their lack of discipline was evident compared to the soldiers at Squirrel Town. The rider scrambled to his feet, ignoring his injuries. He looked at his dying horse with heartache. The animal had been his faithful partner from Frostguard to the Golden City. Now, It had been ridden to death for this critical order. He poured the last of his herbal tonic into the horse's mouth, whispering, "Rest now, old friend." Knowing the horse was beyond saving, he turned to face the guards. Despite his disheveled appearance, he stood with the authority of a messenger. "I am Poke, a knight under Galash," he rasped. "I carry urgent orders from Commander Gordon and Battle Commander Galash for your leader, Old Barton. Take me to him." The guards, mostly local conscripts with little discipline, were intimidated by his status and the dead horse. Hearing the names of their superiors, their suspicion vanished. They dared not delay. "Follow us," the leader stammered, leading Poke into the camp. The camp was a scene of poverty and domesticity rather than military readiness. Shacks and drying laundry filled the space, with women cooking and children playing in the mud. Nearby, rye ripened in terraced fields. 200 or 300 people were busy harvesting the precious grain. The guard led Poke to an old man harvesting wheat. "Barton, a messenger from the Golden City has urgent orders." Old Barton, around 50, was stocky and weathered, his hands calloused like tree bark. Dressed in patched rags and a straw hat, he looked like a common farmer. Only his worn scimitar and sharp, piercing eyes hinted at his military past. Poke frowned, skeptical that this man could command a battle. He seemed more like a peasant than a battle commander. This was the reality of the Solon frontier. As military households, they had to farm to survive. Survival took precedence over training in these neglected outposts. Promised supplies from local lords had long since ceased as the lords ignored their obligations. Barton, a minor commander, lacked the power to challenge them. To keep his men from starving, he had prioritized farming over drills. Of his 1,000 men, fewer than 500 were combat-ready, and most were half-farmers. Barton assessed the arrogant messenger and the dead horse, guessing the gravity of the situation. He bowed respectfully. "I am Barton. How may I serve?" Poke suppressed his disdain, focusing on the mission. He handed over a sealed parchment. "Orders from Gordon and Galash," Poke declared. "Occupy Grey Wolf Valley immediately and annihilate any Carnford army forces you find. Our main force is advancing from Squirrel Town toward Nayland Castle. We will drive the Carnford army into your trap at the valley to crush them. You have 2 days to secure the valley. It is the key to the entire campaign. If you fail, the commander's military law will be merciless." He shoved the parchment into Barton's dirt-stained hands, waiting for action. Barton stood stunned, the parchment feeling like a burning iron in his hands. Poke's cold, lethal commands echoed in his mind, leaving him blank. "Occupy the valley, annihilate the enemy, pincer attack." The words felt absurd and desperate. Do the commanders even know the state of our forces? Barton thought bitterly. Barton's men were no longer elite soldiers. They were military households and farmers, poor wretches struggling to survive in the wilderness for a scrap of food. They might manage logistics like transporting grain or guarding captured cities, but nothing more. But to launch an offensive against a position recently seized by the Carnford army, likely fortified and heavily guarded? How is that possible? Old Barton screamed silently. He envisioned his soldiers, armed with rusted blades and sharpened sticks, being mowed down like wheat by the Carnford army's muskets and disciplined formations. Poke, seeing Barton frozen with the order in hand, grew impatient and disdainful. "What is it, Officer Barton?" Poke demanded coldly, his voice dripping with menace. "You seem reluctant to carry out the command." The words hit Barton like ice water, snapping him out of his despair. He met Poke's cold, scrutinizing gaze, his heart pounding. Disobeying orders in the Solon army was a capital offense, especially during an emergency. "No, not at all," Barton stammered, his voice cracking. "The order is absolute. We will execute it." He swallowed hard, trying to appear composed while pleading. "Sir Knight, you don't understand our situation. Our garrison, we cannot meet the command's requirements." Poke waved him off, dismissively underestimating the enemy. "Carnford has few men left in Grey Wolf Valley. Their main force is at Nayland Castle. At most, there are 100 or 2 of the weak and wounded. Your men can crush them in a single rush." Barton smiled bitterly. A single rush? The knight vastly overestimated his men. Only desperate men or fanatics could charge into musket fire. His men were neither. Most had never seen blood. Their only combat being disputes over hunting grounds. Ordering them to charge a well-equipped, fortified regular army was a death sentence. If the Carnford army were so easily defeated, they wouldn't have swept from Grey Wolf Valley to Nayland Castle. To Barton, the knight's optimism was suicidal. Yet, he couldn't refuse. Refusal meant immediate execution. Compliance at least offered a sliver of hope. Looking at his men harvesting grain in the fields, unaware of their fate, Barton pleaded, "Sir, can we at least finish the harvest? If we leave now, the crop will rot. Without this food, our soldiers won't survive the winter." His voice dropped, heavy with a farmer's attachment to the land and fear for the future. Polk's face darkened, his disgust peaking at the officer's obsession with crops. "There is no time, Officer Barton," Polk snapped. "The situation is critical. Stop the harvest, assemble the troops, and prepare to attack at dawn. I will join your unit," Polk added, "to ensure you carry out the order." Polk turned and strode toward the gate to check on his fallen warhorse. His mission was to ensure this unreliable old man followed orders. He wasn't worried. He believed 500 men were more than enough to crush the small garrison at Grey Wolf Valley. Barton stood frozen, unable to utter a word. All his excuses were pale and worthless before this representative of absolute authority. He turned back to the golden wheat fields. The sunset dyed the fields blood red, where his brothers and kin worked, sweating to ensure they wouldn't starve. They worked with weary anticipation of the harvest. Most were unaware that a cold, lethal order had already sealed their fate. In Grey Wolf Valley, the sunset cast a warm, golden glow over the site of recent bloodshed. The atmosphere, however, was one of frantic activity. Oliver, the stern, one-eyed veteran and commander of the militia, stood on a rise, monitoring the work. His voice was hoarse from days of shouting, yet remained sharp and authoritative. "First platoon, move that beam to the base of the western arrow tower. Secure it. Second platoon, stop slacking. Strip those houses and move all wood and stone to the central fortress. Laborers, move those sharpened spears to the defense points. 3 per man." Under Oliver's command, 60 militiamen and 100 laborers were dismantling buildings to reinforce their defenses. They had not wasted a moment since the main force left. Oliver had transformed the former lord's residence into a functional, small-scale stone and wood fortress. The structure featured reinforced walls, arrow towers, and lookout posts. Knowing his limited manpower, Oliver utilized the terrain to create a defensive network. He fortified surrounding buildings to serve as support points for flanking fire. These points were connected to the central fortress via cleared lines of sight and shallow trenches. Oliver's strategy ensured that no matter where the Solonians attacked, they would face fire from multiple directions. To compensate for his lack of numbers, he had laborers craft hundreds of sharpened wooden spears. These armed the 100 laborers, turning them into quasi-soldiers capable of defensive thrusts from behind cover. Oliver also conducted intensive military training for the laborers during every spare moment. He taught them basic commands, how to hold formation behind cover, how to thrust spears, how to remain calm, and, most importantly, that retreat meant death by military law. "My specialty," Oliver had told his subordinates, "is turning a farmer with a hoe into a soldier who can stand in a line in the shortest time possible." Oliver knew his hastily trained force was green, but it was all he had. His paper strength rose from 60 to 160 men. Of these, 100 were laborers with days of experience, and the 60 militia were inferior to my regulars in training and gear. Their combat effectiveness was, as Oliver expected, highly questionable. Yet, Oliver remained confident in the defensive force he had built. His confidence stemmed from his military experience and a secret weapon he had prepared. As my main force prepared to leave Grey Wolf Valley, Oliver approached Roland, who was managing logistics. Instead of requesting more soldiers, he asked for clay pots, lamp oil, and flammable grease salvage from destroyed Solon villages. Roland, though puzzled, granted the request, providing dozens of pots and barrels of oil. During the Carnford night raid, Oliver had learned how to craft Molotov cocktails. The weapon was simple, a clay pot filled with flammable oil, sealed with an oil-soaked cloth fuse. Once lit and thrown, the pot shattered, creating a fire zone to block enemies or ignite their wooden shields and gear. Oliver had secretly tasked a few nimble soldiers to craft dozens of these, storing them as a surprise for the Solonians. With our fortifications and these, we should hold against small Solon units, Oliver calculated. For me at Nayland Castle, a quiet gray wolf valley was ideal. But for Oliver, eager to prove his worth and move past his injury-induced retirement, the situation was different. Deep down, he craved an attack. "Come," he whispered, watching the dark mountains. "If you dare attack, I will prove to the Lord that I can hold this position alone." He turned his gaze toward the looming, ominous gray wolf mountain. From the valley floor, the mountain looked like a crouching beast watching their meager camp. Sunset faded, and the valley was swallowed by twilight. A cold, howling wind swept through the valley. I had warned of a Solon camp on Grey Wolf Mountain, but its size remained unknown. Oliver's scouts had failed to gather intelligence due to dense forests and hidden Solon sentries. The mountain remained silent. To a veteran like Oliver, this silence was more unsettling than noise. "Forget it," Oliver breathed, suppressing his anxiety. He turned back to his makeshift castle, his resolve hardening. "The preparations are complete," he muttered into the wind. "Fortifications are built, weapons issued, and Molotov cocktails ready. The men have basic training. Supplies will last half a month. Now, we wait to see if the Solonians dare to descend." The next morning, Grey Wolf Valley was shrouded in mist. The peace was shattered by frantic footsteps. A scout, a former hunter, sprinted into the camp, pale and gasping. "My lord, the Solon camp has mobilized. They are descending the mountain toward us." Oliver's heart skipped a beat, but he remained calm. "Steady. How many are there?" The scout struggled to breathe, his terror evident. "I didn't get close, but the mountain is swarming with them. They are everywhere, definitely more than us." Such vague descriptions were useless for military planning. Oliver frowned. The lack of concrete numbers was a major tactical disadvantage. Still, he couldn't blame the untrained scout. His men were not professional scouts. Expecting them to count enemy banners under pressure was unrealistic. Simply returning to report was enough. Oliver dismissed the scout and made his decision. Preparing for the worst, he sent 3 riders to alert me. He then ordered his men, "Sound the alarm. Get everyone to the center immediately. The enemy is here." 2 militia members rushed to the gong and drum, striking them with all their might. Clang! Boom! The frantic noise shattered the morning silence, echoing through the valley. The sound triggered an immediate reaction. Laborers and militia dropped their tools, and women stopped their chores. "War! The Solonians are here." Panic spread, but thanks to Oliver's training, it did not turn into a rout. Everyone abandoned their tasks and sprinted toward the central fortress. Footsteps, gasps, and sporadic shouts mixed with the relentless beating of drums, plunging Grey Wolf Valley into a state of unprecedented chaos. Sentries returned one after another, their faces pale with terror. "My lord, we saw them. A massive force is descending from the mountains. They cover the hills. At least 1,000. More. I'd say several thousand, maybe 10,000. Oliver remained calm, knowing fear often caused sentries to wildly overestimate enemy numbers. Regardless of the exact count, one thing was certain. The enemy far outnumbered my 160 men. Oliver looked at the panicked militia and laborers gathering in the central square, steeling his resolve. "No matter how many come, I must hold. This is my mission and my chance to prove myself. Grey Wolf Valley must not fall. The army's retreat route depends on us." About 160 men had gathered in the village center, a dense, anxious crowd. Whispers of fear and uncertainty filled the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere. "Silence." Oliver climbed a makeshift platform and roared with a hoarse but powerful voice. The recent military drills finally proved their worth. Hearing the command, the men instinctively quieted and straightened their postures. The crowd fell silent, their eyes, filled with fear, expectation, or numbness, fixed on the limping, stern-faced commander. Oliver scanned the crowd, confirming most were present. He took a breath and began his mobilization. "Listen up. The Solonians are descending from the mountains toward Grey Wolf Valley." A wave of stifled gasps rippled through the crowd. "I don't know their numbers," Oliver shouted, his gaze cutting through the crowd. But it doesn't matter. His voice rose with lethal determination. Whether there are 1,000 or 10,000, we have only one choice. Hold this position to the death. He pointed south. Ahead of us, my elite Conford army is locked in a bloody battle with the Solonians. Grey Wolf Valley is their only retreat. If we fail, their path is cut off. It would be a catastrophe. We have no retreat. Fight to the last man, bleed until the end, and hold this valley for me and Conford. His words struck the men like heavy hammers. Fear remained, but it was now tempered by a sense of desperate, tragic duty. The militia, having received more training, grasped the gravity of their honor. Now, Oliver commanded, distribute weapons and armor. Move to your assigned positions immediately. 1st and 2nd Militia Platoons, take the central fortress and arrow towers. 3rd Platoon and 1st/2nd Labor Squads, secure the west. 4th Platoon and 3rd/4th Labor Squads, secure the east. The rest, stay with me as the reserve force. Move. The Solonians are almost here. The crowd erupted into motion, spurred by his sharp orders. Veterans opened the temporary armory, distributing sharpened wooden spears, worn leather armor, chainmail, and a few bows and swords. Men scrambled to equip themselves and hurried to their designated defensive points. The valley filled with the sounds of running, clashing metal, and heavy breathing. A tense, suffocating atmosphere of impending battle gripped the valley. Oliver watched his hastily armed, untested force take their positions with complex emotions. The rising sun broke through the morning mist, illuminating the mountain path and the slow-moving black tide of the enemy. Standing on the central fortress's watchtower, Oliver gripped a brass monocular, observing the enemy intently. Roland had given him this monocular before leaving. It was now his only reliable tool for reconnaissance. As the mist cleared, Oliver felt his anxiety settle slightly. The Solon army's formation became clear. At the front were a dozen elites or personal guards, wearing decent leather armor with iron plating, carrying wooden shields and scimitars. Behind them was the main force. Oliver counted, about 30 men per rank, roughly 20 ranks deep. 30 times 20, 600 men. Oliver calculated, arriving at a realistic estimate. 600. He lowered the monocular, feeling a flicker of relief, though his expression remained grave. 600 was far more than his 160, but it was far less than the terrifying thousands the sentries had feared. A 1-to-4 ratio was steep, but with defensive fortifications, it was a fightable battle. He raised the monocular again to assess their equipment and morale. His confidence grew. Aside from the frontline guards, the 600 soldiers were poorly equipped, wearing dirty, patched hemp clothing. Few had proper leather armor. Most had improvised protection made of rags or wood. Their weapons were crude, mostly sharpened wooden spears. Many carried axes, sickles, or simple sharpened sticks. Their formation was a mess, no discipline, just a disorganized, stumbling crowd. They looked less like an invading army and more like a mob of peasants or thugs gathered for a village brawl. Their morale was low. The ranks were silent and lacked the ferocity of an attacking force. It seems their situation on the mountain is no better than mine, Oliver thought, a sense of grim irony washing over him. The enemy force was clearly a group of conscripts, and their combat effectiveness was likely abysmal. This discovery did little to comfort the recruits. While Oliver could see details through his telescope, the militia and laborers on the walls saw only a massive, faceless black tide pressing toward them. The psychological weight of such overwhelming numbers was impossible to ignore. Oliver heard the ragged breathing, chattering teeth, and the clatter of weapons against the wooden walls. Many faces were pale, their fingers trembling on their spears. "Stop shaking," Oliver roared, his voice harsh. "It's just 500 or 600 Solonians. Have some backbone." He gestured at the enemy with disdain. "Look at them. They look like beggars wielding firewood. What's there to fear? Kill 3 each, and they're finished," he promised, offering a forced, absurd optimism. "Win this, and I'll personally recommend you to me for promotion to the regular army." He added the ultimate incentive: 2 silver coins a month, a house in Conford, and no land taxes. "How about that?" A scattered, fearful response followed. To these novices, no promise could outweigh the impending scent of death. Killing 3? They just wanted to survive. Pay and housing were irrelevant if they died. Oliver knew this was just to steady their nerves. Their survival depended on his command and the fortifications. He pocketed his telescope and climbed down the ladder, his injured leg throbbing, though he ignored the pain. Before the enemy reached striking distance, he limped through the defenses to inspect the lines. At the central fortress, the militia were in position, tense but holding their posts. The situation was worse at the east and west outposts, where laborers were fumbling with their spears. Squad leaders were frantically correcting their stances. Stay steady. Watch the front. Wait for my command. Oliver moved through the ranks, offering rough encouragement and physical corrections to instill a sense of security. I sighed inwardly at their terrified, youthful faces. I knew this fear was inevitable. I had been there once. Courage only comes after surviving the first taste of blood. I hope they don't break at the first charge, I muttered, returning to my command post at the central fortress gate. Through the observation hole, I watched the Solon army gathering at the valley entrance with cold, focused eyes. My initial anxiety had vanished, replaced by the calm, lethal intent of a veteran. My hand drifted to my notched but sharp short sword. Come on then, I whispered. Let's see if your 600 rabble can break the wall I built. At the front of the Solon line, Old Barton and Knight Poke observed the transformed Grey Wolf Valley. Recent messengers from the Golden City had brought urgent orders and minimal reinforcements. Poke and his fellow knights now held actual command, leaving Old Barton as a mere figurehead. The valley was no longer a scattered village. A fortified central building with a watchtower stood at its heart. 2 reinforced houses flanked it as defensive outposts. The area had been cleared for fields of fire, with trenches and fences installed. Figures moved rapidly between the buildings. The towers were being manned for the final defense. They've spotted us, Poke said grimly. They've likely sent word to their main army. We must take this place immediately, or we'll be crushed between their main force and this garrison. Their mission was to block the Carnford army's retreat. Failure meant being trapped between a fortress and a pursuing army. Old Barton looked at the defenses with visible hesitation. He knew his men were ill-suited for a direct assault. But the defenses are strong. Perhaps we should. They're just reinforced houses. Poke interrupted, sneering at Barton's cowardice. And look, their numbers are thin. Poke outlined his plan. We won't hit the center first. It's too strong, and the outposts would flank us. We'd suffer heavy losses. We split up. Barton, take half and hit the west outpost. I'll take the rest and hit the east. We clear the outposts one by one, isolating the center. Then, we crush it in one go. The plan was sound in theory, provided they could actually take the outposts. Barton wanted to protest the division of forces and his own lack of confidence, but the threatening glares from the knights silenced him. He realized he was merely an expendable tool. Yes, knight, Barton replied bitterly. Good. Move out, Poke ordered. The 600 Solonians were split in 2. Barton led 300 toward the west. Poke and the knights led 300 toward the east. Before the charge, Barton forced a weak speech upon his terrified men. Brothers, the valley is ahead. There are few defenders. Kill them, and the supplies are ours. The commanders will reward us. Charge. Under the stern gaze of Poke and the knights, the 300 Solon soldiers let out a ragged, reluctant cheer, driven more by fear of military law than morale. Old Barton gave a weak shout to charge, and the men rushed toward the isolated western reinforced house, brandishing makeshift spears, machetes, and sickles. Meanwhile, the situation on the eastern flank was starkly different. Poke and his knights, clad in high-quality iron-studded leather or chainmail and armed with scimitars and spears, stood at the front. For the glory of Solon. For Lord Galosh. Poke roared, raising his scimitar. Charge. Kill these southern savages. Grey Wolf Valley is ours. His knights and soldiers echoed him with a thunderous, bloodthirsty cry. Led by these formidable warriors, the morale of the 300 eastern Solon soldiers surged. They followed Poke in a more organized and ferocious charge toward the eastern stronghold. 600 Solon soldiers surged like 2 muddy tides toward the valley's defensive flanks, accompanied by deafening war cries. From the central fortress, Oliver watched the enemy split their forces. His heart sank. They weren't just blindly attacking the center. The commander has some sense, Oliver muttered. Targeting the perimeter to isolate the center, not a complete fool. This was the worst-case scenario for Oliver, who relied on mutually supporting outposts to compensate for his numerical disadvantage. If a perimeter point fell, the entire defensive system would collapse, leaving the central fortress surrounded. With no time for regret, Oliver had to react immediately. Trumpeter, Oliver barked at a young militiaman. Sound the horn. Order the archers on both flanks to fire. Aim carefully, don't panic. A sharp, urgent horn blast cut through the din of battle, signaling the archers. On the western side, 10 trembling militiamen and laborers aimed their bows at the approaching 300 Solonians. The squad leader screamed, "Fire!" A dozen arrows flew out in a scattered volley. Most missed entirely. Only 2 or 3 landed, causing a minor stir and a brief cry of pain among the attackers. The eastern side fared slightly better, bolstered by a few experienced veterans. 20 arrows were loosed, showing significantly better accuracy and force than the western volley. 3 or 4 Solon soldiers fell, their momentum momentarily checked. However, this minor resistance failed to stop the fanatical charge. Poke and his knights roared, "Don't stop!" They're few. Push through. Inspired, the Solon soldiers ignored the thin rain of arrows and closed to within dozens of meters of the houses. Oliver gripped the battlements, his eyes tense. He knew the true test had begun. The survival of the Lord's army depended on whether these hastily armed recruits could hold their ground. Poke led the charge to the eastern house, his confidence unshaken. An arrow was embedded in his chest armor, still quivering. The archer had lacked the strength or distance to pierce his high-quality armor. The arrow was merely lodged in a seam. Instead of fear, the incident fueled Poke's ferocity and confidence in his gear. He ripped the arrow out, tossed it aside, and glared at the reinforced house. The door was barricaded from within with debris and timber. "Ram the door. Break it down," Poke commanded. Strong soldiers hoisted a makeshift log ram and slammed it into the barricaded door. A dull thud echoed as the door frame groaned and dust rained down. The Conford commander inside shouted, "Second floor? Shoot the men at the door. Don't let them break through." Archers fired from the windows, but they had to expose themselves to aim, making them vulnerable. The shots were ineffective, mostly missing the men at the ram. By exposing themselves, the archers lost the ability to draw their bows fully and became targets themselves. Solon soldiers with hunting bows and crude crossbows returned fire, creating a lethal threat at close range. A sharp whistle, followed by a thud. A Conford archer screamed as he was hit in the shoulder, causing a brief panic among the defenders. Another heavy blow struck the door, leaving visible cracks. Conford soldiers inside strained against the barricade, sweat and dust streaking their faces. They felt the barricade shifting. The door would not hold much longer. The commander realized the other outposts were equally overwhelmed and could offer no aid. The central fortress's archers were doing what they could, but it wasn't enough. No more waiting. The commander gritted his teeth, reaching for my last resort. "Use the Molotov cocktails. Bring out the jars," he roared. 2 soldiers, pale-faced, brought out clay jars padded with straw and rags. The jars were filled with lamp oil and animal fat, sealed with oil-soaked cloth fuses. "Light them. Throw them at the ramming team," the commander screamed. A soldier's hand trembled as he lit the fuse, which flared up with a pungent, oily smoke. "Throw." A soldier hurled a lit ceramic jar through the second-story window. It shattered near the Solonians, battering the door, spraying sticky, burning oil and cloth everywhere. Flames erupted on the ground and the soldiers. The Solonians shrieked, stopping their assault to frantically extinguish the fire on their clothes. However, the oil was not high-grade naphtha. Its combustion was limited and lacked the explosive, clinging intensity of true incendiaries. Poke was startled by the attack, but quickly realized the fire posed little threat. He kicked away a burning rag and roared at his panicked men. "Don't panic. It's just oil. Stomp it out. Keep hitting the door. They're out of tricks." Under his command, the Solonians regained their composure, stamping out the scattered flames. The men who had caught fire were helped by their comrades. Despite some burns, they remained combat ready. Again. Ramp, Poke ordered. The Solonians had prepared for this, and their assault did not falter. Ladders. Bring the ladders, a soldier shouted from the rear. Crude but sturdy wooden ladders, tipped with iron hooks or natural forks, were brought forward to ensure they couldn't be pushed away once set. To the second-floor windows. Attack from above, Poke commanded. The Solonians hoisted a ladder, its iron hooks latching firmly onto the windowsill. Follow me. Poke gripped his scimitar in his teeth and nimbly climbed the ladder. Despite his heavy armor, his movements were those of a seasoned veteran. Similar ladders were raised at other windows simultaneously. The Solonian assault shifted from a frontal ramming to a two-pronged attack, significantly increasing the pressure. The Conford commander's face paled. He knew the most dangerous moment had arrived. If these fierce Solonians, especially their leader, breached the second floor, the entire stronghold would collapse. Ignore the door, he screamed. Spearmen, shield bearers, guard the windows. Don't let them up. Stab and slash them down. Archers, aim for the climbers. Chaos erupted at the windows. Conford soldiers stabbed blindly with spears while archers fired at point-blank range. Below, the rhythmic thud, thud of the battering ram continued, sounding like a death knell. The reinforced house swayed like a small boat in a storm, on the verge of capsizing. Poke watched as a Solonian soldier ahead of him was struck in the face by an arrow and tumbled off the ladder. Poke reacted instantly, hugging the ladder tightly to minimize his profile. The falling body crashed into the Solonians below, causing a brief commotion. Ignoring the chaos, Poke spotted a Conford archer leaning out to confirm the kill. Fool, Poke sneered. I drew a hand axe from my belt, my scimitar still clenched in my teeth. Balancing with one hand, I hurled the axe at the exposed archer. Thwack! The axe struck the archer's face with lethal precision, burying deep into the bone. The archer let out a shrill scream before collapsing backward, dead before he hit the floor. The Solonians below cheered. I seized the moment, climbing rapidly toward the sill. As I peeked over, I saw a flash of steel to my left. Instinct took over. I jerked my head and body to the right. A spear tip grazed my scalp, the wind of its passage stinging my ear and shearing off hair. A chill ran down my spine. I had narrowly escaped death. A seasoned knight. I forced myself to stay calm, realizing that climbing directly into the guarded window was too risky. I reached for my second-hand axe. This works better, I muttered, drawing the weapon. Without looking, I threw the axe blindly into the room toward where the spear had emerged. A crash followed by a cry of pain confirmed I had struck someone. I was pleased, but I was now unarmed, and fighting with a scimitar on a ladder was suicide. Someone, get me a spear. Now, I shouted down. Seeing me holding the sill, the Solonians' morale surged. Soldiers climbed up, passing a long wooden spear toward me. Catch it, my lord, a soldier yelled. I gripped the sturdy Solonian spear, balancing myself on the ladder. I began thrusting the spear blindly and ferociously into the room. I didn't need precision. I only needed to suppress the defenders to create an opening. The spear thudded repeatedly into wooden walls. The Conford defenders, though panicked, mustered their courage and thrust their own spears back through the window in a desperate, chaotic counterattack. A stalemate formed at the window. Both sides blindly poked spears through the opening, unable to land a hit due to the restricted angles. As spear shafts clattered, the Conford garrison commander inside breathed a sigh of relief. He hoped that by holding this stalemate, reinforcements or archers from the central fortress would arrive, or the enemy would eventually tire. Suddenly, Poke seized the perfect moment when the defenders poked their spears outward. With a sharp lateral sweep of his spear, he knocked the defenders' weapons aside, destabilizing their formation. The Conford soldiers stumbled, their spears momentarily pulled back from the window. Seizing the gap, Poke used the momentum of his sweep and a powerful kick against the ladder to launch himself. With a shout, he vaulted through the window like a bird. Within seconds, the armored Solon leader crashed onto the floor, catching the defenders completely off guard. The heavy thud stunned everyone. Poke rolled to absorb the impact, stabilized, and knelt, looking up. He saw only terrified Conford militia and laborers, poorly armed and armored. To a veteran Solon knight, they were mere sheep. Without hesitation, Poke rose, fists balled, his iron-studded gauntlets ready. He punched the nearest laborer in the face, shattering his nose and sending him crashing into a crate. The other defenders shrieked in panic. The militia commander roared, "Kill him!" and charged with his sword. It was too late. Poke tore through the group like a tiger, using only his fists, elbows, and knees. The room filled with the sounds of breaking bones and agonized screams. He disarmed one militiaman and kneed him into a fetal position, then vomited. He caught a laborer's club with his gauntlet arm, snapping the wood, before grabbing the man by the throat and slamming him down. Poke's brutal, efficient violence shattered the morale of the inexperienced defenders. "He's a devil. Run!" they cried, abandoning their weapons to flee. The commander's desperate orders to hold the line went ignored. Poke smirked, finally drawing his scimitar. Seeing his men flee, the veteran commander realized the position was lost. He chose not to run, locking eyes with the blood-stained Poke. The dripping scimitar served as a silent provocation. The commander took a breath, refusing to surrender. He drew his trusted arming sword. The blade felt heavy and sharp, offering a final sense of security. Gripping the hilt, he stared at Poke with predatory focus. As other Solon soldiers climbed in, eager to swarm the lone officer, Poke intervened. "Stand down," he commanded with authority. His men paused, confused. Poke looked at the defiant commander with a mix of mockery and appreciation. He respected the man's warrior spirit, even if it was futile. He gestured mockingly with his hand. The message was clear: "Show me what you've got." The blatant disrespect ignited the commander's final rage. With a roar, the commander lunged, thrusting his sword toward Poke's chest with desperate speed. To a veteran like Poke, the attack was simple. Poke sidestepped and deflected the blade with the back of his scimitar. The clang of metal left the commander's guard wide open. The commander retreated, attempting a desperate horizontal slash. Poke's counterattack was a blur of lethal, precise strikes. Steel clashed repeatedly. The commander struggled, his swordplay clumsy against Poke's superior skill. His hand went numb, blood slicking the hilt as he faltered. A flash of steel sliced the commander's left arm, spraying blood and forcing him to pause. Poke struck again, leaving no room for defense. The scimitar pierced the commander's chest, exiting his back. The man froze, staring at the blade and then at Poke's cold, mocking face. He tried to speak, but only coughed up a mouthful of blood. The commander's eyes lost their luster, his final expression of defiance and fury frozen in death. Poke coldly twisted his scimitar and pulled it free. The commander collapsed with a dull thud, his sword clattering to the floor. "Charge! Storm the ground floor! Kill everyone!" Poke ordered, flicking blood from his blade. Emboldened by their leader's easy victory, the Solon soldiers roared with peak morale. Like a pack of wolves, they surged toward the stairs. Poke calmly wiped his blade clean on the dead commander's clothes as if polishing art, then followed his men at a leisurely pace. The ground floor was in total chaos. Refugees scrambled frantically, desperate to flee the slaughterhouse. The remaining militia tried to stop the retreat, fearing the gate would fall if everyone fled. Shouts of "Hold the line" clashed with panicked cries of "Let me out" and the sounds of scuffles. The militia's attempts to maintain order only weakened the defense further. The Solon soldiers burst down the stairs, cutting into the disorganized crowd like tigers among sheep. The militia failed to organize any resistance and were quickly shattered. Men were cut down, speared, or trampled by their own panicked comrades before being finished off by the Solonians. The terrified refugees were even worse off. Lacking any combat spirit, they screamed and huddled in corners, waiting for death. It was a one-sided massacre in every corner of the room. Blood soaked the earth, filling the air with a sickening stench. Poke watched from the stairs, his expression indifferent. He had no interest in participating in such a slaughter. He preferred the thrill of a duel with a worthy opponent. The ground floor was soon cleared. Aside from a few lucky escapees, the fortified outpost fell in less than an hour. The defeat spread like a contagion. Two smaller nearby outposts were soon breached by the Solonians using similar tactics. One outpost offered stiffer resistance, inflicting casualties on the attackers. However, overwhelmed by superior numbers and the psychological blow of the earlier fall, they were eventually overrun. In under 2 hours, Polk's forces had dismantled the eastern perimeter of Grey Wolf Valley. Only the central fortress and the western outpost remained. From the central fortress, Oliver watched through his binoculars as the eastern outpost fell. A refugee crawled from a window, sprinting away in terror. His flight lasted only seconds. A sullen soldier chased him down, hacking him in the neck from behind. The man collapsed, twitching, and went still. Through the lens, Oliver saw no more resistance. Only Solonians looting the corpses. Damn it! Oliver gritted his teeth in impotent rage. The outpost had collapsed with shocking speed. He cursed the refugees, but also his own wishful thinking. He felt a bitter sense of self-reproach. He knew well that raw refugees couldn't be turned into elite soldiers overnight. He hadn't expected them to win, only to hold the line behind fortifications with bows and Molotov cocktails to drain the enemy. Yet they hadn't even lasted an hour, and his Molotov cocktails had barely caused a ripple. The loss was a devastating blow to both his defenses and morale. Oliver turned his gaze west, where the sounds of battle still echoed. The defense there seemed more organized, and the Solonians less aggressive, allowing it to hold. The enemy's elite and their commander are in the east, Oliver realized. He had no reinforcements to send. His own fortress was the next target. He watched the bloodstained Solonians regroup under their knight commander. They were clearly preparing to assault the central fortress. Oliver lowered his binoculars, his anger replaced by a cold, focused resolve. "Prepare yourselves," he roared to his men. "The Solonians are coming. Archers to the walls. Spearmen, take your positions. Watch the east." With the western outposts still holding, Oliver concentrated his remaining forces on the eastern front. The fortress atmosphere grew tense but disciplined as the trained militia moved into position. Archers climbed the wooden ladders to the walls and arrow towers, checking their gear. Spearmen and shield bearers gathered behind the gate, preparing their weapons for the coming clash. These men, handpicked and trained by me from the militia battalion, displayed a steady composure born of combat, despite their underlying tension. Their eyes held vigilance for the coming bloodbath, devoid of the despair typical of laborers. Seeing my men, Oliver's expression softened. He had genuine confidence in them. They were the bravest, toughest, and most disciplined soldiers in the militia battalion, specifically chosen for this deep penetration mission. Many had survived the defense of Conford, having already tasted blood and endured arrows. Relying on these fortifications, defending against the Solon soldiers. "It's well within our capabilities," I told myself, bolstering my own resolve. I raised my binoculars to look east. The Solonians had regrouped, numbering about 250 to 260, having suffered casualties while taking the three outposts. Led by a knight, they formed a disciplined line and began a steady advance toward the central fortress. In the sunlight, their blood-stained weapons and armor glinted coldly. Their pace was now steady and powerful, carrying the confidence of victors certain of their final prey. Through my lenses, Oliver's gaze locked with the sharp eyes of the Solon knight leading the formation. A faint, cold smirk touched my lips. "Come then," I whispered, my voice filled with the resolve of a blade about to be unsheathed. "Let me see exactly what you're capable of." I lowered the binoculars, my expression hardening into one of icy, rock-like determination. I turned and walked with a steady, limping gait down from the watchtower to the eastern wall's command post. I would personally command my elite force here to meet the fierce Solon knight and his men. Regardless of the outcome, I would fight until the very end. Polk led his 200-plus men across blood-soaked ground toward the central fortress, the fortified former home of Lord Derek in Grey Wolf Valley. The recent slaughter had left the Solon soldiers' morale high, their eyes still burning with excitement. Led by Polk and several other knights in fine armor, the formation accelerated from a march to a trot. Soon, they entered the effective range of the fortress archers. Polk looked up as several standard, albeit sparse, parabolic arcs crossed the sky. "Shields up. Defend against arrows." Polk barked. These were not panicked laborers, but trained militia, many of them former hunters, possessing superior marksmanship and nerves. Polk was prepared. He had ordered his men to fashion crude wooden shields from the debris of destroyed houses. They had also scavenged clothing, leather armor, and chainmail fragments from the corpses of the defenders to reinforce their protection. Thud! Arrows rained down, most embedding themselves into the raised wooden shields. Only a few high-velocity shots pierced the makeshift shields to strike the men behind them. Occasional cries of pain erupted, but the arrows, slowed by the shields and thick scavenged clothing, caused only minor flesh wounds. The Southerners' arrows are useless. Charge! They can't stop us. Seeing the arrows fail to inflict significant damage, the Solon soldiers' morale surged, and they broke into a run, rapidly closing the distance. I watched from the wall, my expression devoid of surprise or panic. I knew that bows alone could not stop a motivated, armored force of hundreds. Launch the Molotov cocktails. I ordered calmly, my voice resolute. This was my true trump card, a modified version. Over the past few days, I had used elastic wood, animal tendons, and leather ropes to secretly construct fixed, large-scale slingshots on the second-floor platforms of the central fortress. These crude devices were far more effective and had a longer range than hand-throwing for launching Molotov cocktails to create chaos. Ignite. Load. The militia operators obeyed immediately. One man lit the cloth fuse, while another carefully placed the flaming bottle into the leather pouch. Pull. Several soldiers strained to pull the elastic cords to their limit, the wood groaning under the tension. Fire. With a snap, the elastic energy launched the flaming clay pots, which traced high, smoky arcs through the air toward the charging Solon army. "What is that?" a sharp-eyed soldier shouted, pointing at the fireballs in the sky. Poke looked up, his heart sinking. He had witnessed the power of these Molotov cocktails at the outposts. They were a massive threat to morale in a dense formation. Shields up. Keep charging. Don't stop. Don't scatter. Poke realized that breaking formation now would be fatal. Their only hope was to keep their shields tight and sprint through the kill zone. Pick up the pace. Charge, he roared, leading the way. The true danger of the Molotov cocktails lay in their psychological terror. A bottle struck a soldier's shield, shattering and splashing viscous oil that ignited instantly. The soldier screamed as his shield became a torch, forcing him to discard it and scramble behind his comrades for cover. Worse followed. Another bottle hit a soldier directly. The clay pot exploded on his chest, drenching him in burning oil. The thick, scavenged clothing he wore to protect himself became fuel, turning him into a human torch. "Help me. Aya!" he shrieked, rolling frantically on the ground. The sight of him burning and the stench of charred flesh terrified the nearby soldiers, causing them to slow down and break their formation. "Don't break. Go around him. Keep charging," Poke shouted, though he felt a chill of his own. He brandished his scimitar, forcing his men to bypass the burning soldier and continue the assault. While the casualties were low, the psychological blow and the disruption to their momentum were significant. Not everyone could remain indifferent to the sight of a comrade burning alive. Amidst the chaos, Oliver ordered his archers to target the Solon soldiers exposed while dodging flames. The archers shifted their aim from the shielded front line to the vulnerable, exposed soldiers. Swish. Thud. Art. The sounds of arrows finding their marks and screams of pain signaled a far more effective volley. Poke, gritting his teeth, realized they had to reach the fortress walls immediately to minimize the threat of arrows and Molotov cocktails. He roared, charging forward. Inspired by his ferocity, the Solon soldiers suppressed their fear and followed him through the thinning but precise rain of arrows toward the central fortress. The distance between the two sides closed rapidly amidst blood and fire. Poke's men reached the base of the central fortress, quickly raising siege ladders against the makeshift walls. The wall, hastily constructed from debris and wood, stood only 2 men high. A poor substitute for a real fortification, yet a formidable obstacle for the Solonians lacking proper siege gear. Charge. A heavy reward for the first to breach. Poke commanded, waving his scimitar. He held back, knowing the resistance here would be far fiercer than at the outer outposts. The enemy commander was tough, and the garrison was disciplined and courageous. Poke intended to let his men exhaust the defenders' strength before he personally intervened to break the stalemate. Kill. Stimulated by the promise of rewards and recent victories, the Solon soldiers swarmed the ladders. Without needing further orders, the Conford garrison engaged in desperate, fanatical resistance. Spearmen and shield-bearers roared, hurling stones, wood, and weapons down at the Solon soldiers emerging at the top. Thud. Art. The sounds of impact and screams filled the air as Solon soldiers were struck and sent tumbling back onto their comrades. Archers fired blindly into the dense crowd below, their arrows falling like locusts, claiming lives despite the shields. From a second-floor platform, Oliver hurled Molotov cocktails, targeting the ladders and the base of the wall. Crash. Whoosh. The bottles shattered, drenching the area in sticky, flammable oil that ignited instantly. Several ladders became roaring torches, forcing the climbing Solon soldiers to jump or perish in the flames. A sea of fire formed at the wall's base, the heat and smoke stalling the offensive. The eastern wall became a meat grinder, with both sides locked in a brutal, life-for-life exchange. Every second brought fresh casualties, the air thick with the stench of blood and fire.